173 Elden Ring facts to fall asleep to. Elden Ring is one of those games that rewards obsession. And over the past couple of years, I have spent an embarrassing amount of time digging through item descriptions, obscure NPC dialogue, and community research threads to pull together 173 facts, stories, and lore details that most players never encounter. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Now, a quick note from my end before we get into it. This video took a long time to put together, and the main choice I made when assembling it was to prioritize the stories behind the world rather than gameplay tips or boss strategies. There is a lot of lore in Elden Ring that is intentionally fragmented and left open to interpretation. So throughout this video, when I present something as a reading of the lore rather than hard fact, I will use words like suggests or points toward. I also made a deliberate choice to organize the facts loosely by theme rather than by location or by the order you would encounter things in a playthrough, because I think the stories hit differently when you hear related pieces of lore grouped together. Some things I excluded entirely, like the more speculative fan theories that have no grounding in item text or dialogue. Everything here is rooted in something the game actually shows you, even if the interpretation is mine. Alright, let us get into it. Fact 1. The Elden Ring is not a ring in the conventional sense that most players probably imagine when they first hear the title. It is described in the game's lore as the foundation of the Erd Tree, but more specifically, it functions as a kind of law, a governing principle imposed upon the world by a force called the Greater Will. The physical form it takes, which resembles a golden ring of runes, is actually the visual representation of something more abstract, something closer to a cosmological decree than a piece of jewelry. The item description of the Elden Remembrance, which you receive after defeating the Elden Beast, reads in a way that suggests the Elden Ring and the Elden Beast are deeply connected, possibly even the same entity in different forms. The Elden Beast is described as a golden order made flesh, the living incarnation of the ring itself, sent from the outer god known as the Greater Will to take root in the lands between. This means that when you fight the Elden Beast at the end of the game, you are not just fighting a monster, you are fighting the law itself. You are fighting the foundational principle that has governed this world for an age. That framing changes the encounter entirely when you sit with it. Fact 2. Queen Marika the Eternal is one of the most important figures in all of Elden Ring lore, and the game is remarkably coy about her actual motivations for shattering the Elden Ring. The act of shattering is treated as a kind of cosmic catastrophe, the event that set the entire game's story into motion, but the game never directly tells you why she did it. What it does suggest, through various item descriptions and environmental details, is that Marika may have shattered the Elden Ring as an act of grief and rage following the death of her son Godwyn the Golden during the Night of Black Knives. Godwyn was the first demigod to die, and his death was orchestrated using a fragment of the Rune of Death, stolen from the Elden Ring itself. His soul was killed, but his body was left alive, which the game describes as the first death in the sense of a true and complete ending. Marika's response to this, if the reading holds, was to break the very system that had allowed death to be weaponized in that way. It is an act of destruction that also reads as an act of mourning, which points toward a much more sympathetic portrait of Marika than the game's surface-level narrative might suggest. Fact 3. Radagon of the Golden Order and Queen Marika the Eternal are the same person. This is probably one of the most discussed revelations in Elden Ring, but the implications of it go much further than most players explore. The game confirms this through the painting in Lane Dell and through the loading screen text that simply states Radagon is Marika. But what does that actually mean in the context of the world? One reading suggests that Marika split herself into two distinct identities, one male and one female, in order to circumvent a rule that would have otherwise prevented her from remarrying after her first husband, Godfrey, was exiled. As queen and embodiment of the Elden Ring, Marika may not have been able to take a new husband from outside herself, so she created Radagon as a separate self capable of fulfilling that role. Another reading, which the game also supports, is that Radagon was always a separate consciousness within Marika. a kind of internal counterpart who developed his own loyalties and beliefs over time. By the end of his life, Radagon was devoted to the Golden Order, while Marika had grown to despise it, and the two of them were fighting each other from inside the same body, which is as tragic and strange a relationship as anything in the game. Fact 4. The Erd Tree is not a natural feature of the lands between. It did not grow there organically. It was essentially planted, or at least its presence was engineered, by the greater will through the vessel of the Elden Ring. Before the Erd Tree, there was a different god governing the world, a being associated with the Crucible, which is the primordial state of life that the game describes as an older and more chaotic form of existence. The Crucible Knights, who you encounter as enemies throughout the game, are described as warriors who venerated this older form of life, and they are depicted as ancient and noble, suggesting that the age before the Erd Tree was not necessarily worse, just different. The Erd Tree's arrival essentially replaced one cosmological framework with another, and the Golden Order, that Marika and later Radagon built around it, was an attempt to systematize and control a world that had previously been wilder and more primordial. This points toward one of the game's central tensions, the idea that order imposed from outside, even a beautiful Golden Order, carries within it a kind of violence toward whatever came before. Fact 5. The Knight of Black Knives is one of the most consequential events in Elden Ring's history, and it is never shown to the player directly. Everything you learn about it comes from fragments, descriptions, and the testimony of characters who experienced it from different angles. What the lore suggests happened is this. A group of assassins known as the Black Knife Assassins used blades imbued with a stolen fragment of the Rune of Death to kill several demigods simultaneously, with Godwyn the Golden being among the targets. The assassins themselves are described as Numen women, the same ancient people from whom Marika herself descends. This raises the uncomfortable possibility that the Knight of Black Knives was planned or at least known about in advance by someone close to the highest levels of power in the lands between. The game strongly suggests that Ranni the Witch, one of the game's most prominent characters and a potential ally of the player, orchestrated the Knight of Black Knives specifically to free herself from the influence of the Two Fingers and the Greater Will. She wanted her soul killed while her body survived, which is the inverse of what happened to Godwyn, and she succeeded in using the chaos of that night to accomplish it. The Knight of Black Knives is therefore both a tragedy and a liberation, depending on whose story you are following. Fact 6. Ranni the Witch is, by most readings of the lore, the character who has done the most to resist the Greater Will's influence on the lands between. She is presented initially as a mysterious and somewhat cold figure, and her quest line is one of the longest and most involved in the game. But what lies at the end of it is a genuinely moving story about a being who rejected the destiny that a god had laid out for her and chose to pursue something entirely her own. Ranni's ultimate goal, if you complete her questline, is to find a new order for the world, one not governed by any outer god. The Age of Stars ending, which is what you unlock by following her story to its conclusion, suggests a future in which the lands between drifts into a distant darkness, away from the influence of the Greater Will entirely, guided only by Ranni's will and accompanied by the player character. Whether that is a hopeful ending or a melancholy one depends heavily on how you feel about the Golden Order and whether you think the world is better off, with or without divine governance. Fact 7. Godfrey the First Elden Lord is a figure of almost mythological stature within the game's world, and his story is one of the more genuinely epic things the lore contains. He was originally a warrior chieftain named Hawara Lux, who came to Marika's attention through his ferocity in battle. Marika chose him as her first husband and elevated him to the position of Elden Lord, and together they led wars of conquest across the lands between, using an army of warriors called the Tarnished. After the wars were won, Marika cast Godfrey and his Tarnished out of the lands between by stripping them of the grace that connects people to the Erd Tree. This exile was not necessarily a punishment. One reading suggests that Marika did it deliberately because she knew she would eventually need to shatter the Elden Ring, and she needed a group of warriors who existed outside the system of grace so that they could eventually return and contest for the throne without being beholden to the existing order. Godfrey himself becomes a layered figure when you learn that he voluntarily suppressed his own warrior spirit, a creature called Serosh that you can see riding on his back in order to maintain peace after the wars were over. He made himself lesser, quieter, in service to a world that no longer needed a warlord. That is a kind of sacrifice that the game never draws explicit attention to, but the item descriptions make it clear. Fact 8. The Tarnished, which is what your player character is called, are described as people who lost the grace of the Erd Tree long ago and were sent wandering beyond the lands between. The game begins with you being called back by a new form of grace, a guidance beckoning you to return and claim the title of Elden Lord. What is interesting about the Tarnished as a concept is that the game never fully explains why you specifically were chosen. Other Tarnished are also drawn back, as evidenced by the various NPCs you meet who are also tarnished and also seeking the Elden Ring. But something about your character is different, at least in the framing of the story. The Elden Ring wiki and various item descriptions suggest that the guidance of grace acts somewhat like a filtering mechanism, directing only certain tarnished toward the path that leads to the Erd Tree's throne, and that the quality being selected for is not just strength but something more like an openness to change, a capacity to absorb and use the power of others rather than simply dominate them. Whether that framing flatters or unsettles your image of the player character probably depends on how many cooperators you invaded in the early game. Fact 9. Margit the Fell Omen, the first major boss that most players encounter in Elden Ring, is not actually a separate creature from Morgoth the Omen King. Morgoth is a demigod, the hidden son of Marika and Godfrey, and he conceals his true identity behind the Margit persona, disguising himself as an aged vagrant with a cane in order to ambush Tarnished before they can reach the capital. What makes Morgoth such a fascinating character is that he is an omen, which in the game's world is treated as a kind of birth defect, a sign of divine disfavor. Omens are born with beastly features and are traditionally sealed away in sewers or killed outright because their existence is considered shameful under the laws of the Golden Order. Morgoth, a literal son of the god Queen Marika, was born an omen and was kept hidden in the sewers beneath Leyndell for most of his life. Despite being rejected by the very system his mother created, he devoted himself entirely to defending that system and protecting the Erd Tree from the Tarnished who sought to claim it. His dialogue when you defeat him is one of the most affecting pieces of writing in the game, a cry of genuine anguish from someone who loved a world that never loved him back. Fact 10. The Omen as a concept in Elden Ring connects to something much older and stranger than the Golden Order. The bestial features that mark Omen children, things like horns and claws and other animal characteristics, are described in the lore as remnants of the Crucible, the primordial life state that existed before the Erd Tree. This means that omens are not actually defective. They are, in a sense, throwbacks to an older and arguably more vital form of existence. The Golden Order branded them as abominations because the Crucible represented everything the Erd Tree's civilization was built in opposition to: chaos, animality, uncontrolled growth. But the game's framing consistently points toward the Crucible as something sacred in its own right, and the Crucible Knight enemies you face across the game are depicted as dignified warriors who chose to venerate that older form of life even after the Erd Tree displaced it. The persecution of omens is therefore one of the clearest examples in the game of how the Golden Order's definition of holiness was built on exclusion and violence, even toward beings who carried divine blood. Fact 11. Malenia, the Blade of Miquella, is widely regarded as the hardest boss in Elden Ring, but her lore is just as extraordinary as her difficulty in combat. She was born as a demigod cursed with the Scarlet Rot, a disease associated with one of the outer gods who seeks to corrupt the lands between. The rot has been with her since birth, and she has never been able to fully conquer it, spending her entire life in an ongoing war with a sickness that lives inside her and seeks to consume everything she touches. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, she became one of the greatest warriors the world has ever seen, training herself to a level of martial perfection that the game describes as godhood achieved through effort rather than divine grace. Her arm, which she lost and replaced with a prosthetic, is itself a detail that points toward a lifetime of extreme physical hardship. and the description of her equipment suggests that every piece of her gear was designed to manage and contain the rot, rather than simply to enhance her fighting ability. Fact 12. The Scarlet Rot is not just a disease in the conventional sense. The game's lore suggests it is the physical manifestation of the outer god of rot's influence on the lands between, similar to how the frenzied flame is the physical manifestation of another outer god's touch. Caelid, the ruined region of the game that is almost entirely consumed by the rot, was not always that way. It was devastated during a battle between Melania and Radahn, during which Melania unleashed her power as the vessel of the rot in a moment of desperation, releasing a bloom that scarred the landscape permanently. This event is referred to as the Shattering of Caelid in some fan communities, though the game does not name it explicitly. What the lore points toward is that Melania did not necessarily choose to use the rot willingly. She was pushed to a limit, and the disease that lives within her responded. Whether that makes the devastation of Caelid a tragedy of circumstance or a decision with consequences depends on how you read her character. But either way, the aftermath is one of the most visually striking examples in the game of an outer god's influence being literally written into the landscape. Fact 13. General Radahn, who rules over Caelid and whom many players encounter as a major boss, is one of the most beloved figures in the Elden Ring fan community, and for good reason. His lore is a story of extraordinary will and quiet sacrifice. Radahn was a student of the great sorcerer Radahn in the art of gravitational magic, specifically learning it so that he could keep the stars in the sky. This is not a metaphor, or at least it does not read as one. The lore suggests that Radahn used his gravitational powers to literally hold the movement of the stars in check, preventing them from completing their destined paths, because the fall of certain stars would have consequences for the world that he wanted to prevent. He did this for years, holding back a celestial mechanism through sheer personal effort, and maintained magical focus. When Melania came to fight him, and the battle ended as it did, Radahn lost his mind to the Scarlet Rot, rather than being killed outright, and the stars he had been restraining were finally free to move. One of those stars carried Noxtella, the falling star beast, and another carried what the lore associates with the eventual arrival of Ranni's age. Radahn's defeat, in other words, was a cosmic pivot point, and he endured his long vigil knowing that if he ever faltered, the consequences would be profound. Fact 14. Radahn's relationship with his horse Leonard is one of the small details in Elden Ring that has generated an enormous amount of affection from players. Leonard is a small horse who, by the time you encounter Radahn, is visibly too small to carry a man of Radahn's size. The lore suggests that Radahn was always larger than other men, and that as he grew, Leonard was unable to grow with him, but Radahn refused to abandon him. He learned gravitational magic in part so that he could reduce his own effective weight and continue riding Leonard without harming him. This is a remarkably gentle detail in the story of a man who is otherwise depicted as a devastating warrior. Radahn carried a love for his horse that outlasted his sanity, and even in his maddened state at the Festival of Anticipation, Leonard is still with him, still the horse he chose to ride into that battle, despite all alternatives. Fact 15. The Crucible, as a concept in Elden Ring's lore, is described in the lore as the primal nature of the Elden Ring before it was formalized into the Golden Order. This framing is important because it suggests that the Golden Order was not the original or natural state of things, but rather an imposition on top of something older. The Crucible represents the unregulated, unordered state of life in the lands between, where growth and change were not subject to divine approval. Creatures from the Crucible era sometimes appear in the game as ancient monsters with features that the current world would classify as aberrant, and the game consistently treats them with a mixture of reverence and fear. The fact that Crucible Knight gear is among the most respected and storied armor in the game's world suggests that even within the Golden Order era, there was a memory of and respect for what came before, at least among certain warrior traditions. Fact 16. The Two Fingers and the Three Fingers are among the stranger entities in Elden Ring's cosmology. The Two Fingers serve as intermediaries between the Greater Will and the people of the lands between, communicating the will of the outer god through a kind of sign language interpreted by finger readers. The Three Fingers, on the other hand, represent the frenzied flame, an entirely different and destructive force associated with chaos and the dissolution of all things. What the game suggests through the questline of Hieta, the blind woman who is searching for the three fingers, and a purpose that aligns with the frenzied flame, is that the three fingers offers a form of grace that is available to anyone regardless of their history or standing. While the two fingers guidance is more selective and hierarchical, the frenzied flame ending is one of the more disturbing outcomes in the game, involving the complete destruction of the Golden Order and the incineration of everything. But the path to it is presented with a genuine tenderness that complicates the horror of the destination. Fact 17. Hieta's questline is one of the quietest and most tragic NPC stories in the game. She appears as a blind woman who offers you grapes to eat as a gesture of kindness and connection. And over the course of her questline, you learn that she is being slowly drawn towards something she does not fully understand, a purpose she has been guided toward without her explicit consent. By the end of her questline, she has become a finger maiden of the three fingers, a role that costs her dearly, and her final words to the player are delivered with a kind of peaceful resignation that reads as both heartbreaking and genuine. She is one of several characters in Elden Ring whose arc suggests that the world's systems, whether those of the Greater Will or the Frenzied Flame, tend to use people rather than serve them. Fact 18. The finger readers in Elden Ring, the women with enormously elongated fingers who serve as interpreters for the two fingers, have a lore background that is easy to miss. They are described as having been altered over generations of service to the two fingers, their bodies slowly changed by proximity to the divine instrument they serve. Their elongated fingers are the physical consequence of a lifetime spent touching and interpreting the language of the outer god, a detail that suggests the service of the greater will is not spiritually neutral, but physically transformative. This points toward a broader pattern in the game's lore, where contact with any outer god reshapes the people or creatures in its orbit, whether that reshaping is the golden radiance of the Erd Tree, the rot of the Scarlet God, the madness of the Frenzied Flame, or something else entirely. Fact 19. Melina, the woman who serves as your guide and companion for much of Elden Ring's early and middle sections, is one of the most mysterious characters in the game. She describes herself as a maiden without a finger, which is a significant distinction in a world where finger maidens serve as intermediaries between tarnished warriors and the two fingers. She offers to serve as your guide in exchange for help reaching the Erd Tree, but her ultimate origin and purpose are left largely ambiguous. The game suggests through several details that she is connected to Marika in a fundamental way, possibly being a part of Marika, or a consciousness that Marika created and sent out into the world for a purpose that the game never fully explains. Her eye, which she keeps closed throughout the game, is the same eye that Marika is shown without in the statue at the Erd Tree's base, a detail that points toward a connection between them that goes beyond coincidence. Melina's questline ends differently, depending on whether you pursue the Frenzied Flame ending, and in that version she swears to find you and deliver a punishment, the nature of which is left open. Fact 20. The Lands Between is not a single continent in the conventional sense. The game's geography, which includes subterranean worlds like Nokron and Siofra River and Ainsel River, as well as the main surface world, suggests a layered cosmology in which different civilizations exist at different depths and in different relationships to the Erd Tree above. The underground areas of Elden Ring are not just dungeons. They are remnants of older civilizations that were buried or pushed beneath the surface as the Erd Tree's order expanded. Nokron and Nokstella are described as celestial cities that once existed on the surface and were drawn underground, and the cultures that lived in them worshipped the stars and the moon in ways that were incompatible with the Erd Tree's sun worship. Their burial is therefore not just a geological event, but a cultural suppression, the literal undergrounding of a worldview that the Golden Order could not accommodate. Fact 21. The Finger Slayer blade, which is a key item in Ranni's questline, is described in its item text as having been crafted from the same material as the two fingers themselves. This is one of the more disturbing implications in the game's lore, because it suggests that the beings who built the civilization of Nokron had the knowledge and capability to create weapons specifically designed to kill the Greater Will's intermediaries. This points toward a history of conflict between the underground civilizations and the Golden Order that the surface-level narrative of the game mostly papers over. and it gives additional weight to the idea that Nokron's submersion was not accidental but punitive. Fact 22. Renala, Queen of the Full Moon, is one of the more tragic figures in Elden Ring. She was the head of the Academy of Raya Lucaria before Radagon married her and used the political alliance to integrate the Academy into the broader Golden Order. When Radagon eventually left her to return to Marika, Renala broke down entirely, retreating into a kind of fugue state where she cradles a single golden egg, described as the one gift Radagon gave her, and is tended by her devoted students who have regressed into a childlike attachment to her. What the lore suggests is that Renala is attempting to use the egg to rebirth Radagon, to reconstitute the person she loved, through the same mechanics she uses for rebirth in the game's systems, but that the attempt is doomed to fail because Radagon is gone in a way that cannot be undone by the magic she has access to. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that her children, the demigods Rykard, Radahn, and Ranni, inherited her power and her suffering in different ways. Fact 2003. Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, is a character whose lore arc represents one of the more extreme responses to the shattering of the Elden Ring and the collapse of the Golden Order's authority. Rykard became Lord of the Volcano Manor after consuming the blasphemous serpent in an attempt to gain its power. But the serpent consumed him as much as he consumed it, and the being you fight as a boss is as much serpent as it is Rykard. What makes Rykard compelling as a character is that his rebellion against the Golden Order was ideological. He genuinely believed that the system of gods and demigods that governed the lands between was fundamentally unjust, and he invited the Tarnished to the Volcano Manor, specifically to train and deploy them as assassins against the demigods. His stated goal of devouring the gods themselves reads as sincere even if his methods were extreme, and his own transformation into something monstrous complicates his role as a voice of dissent. Fact 24. The Volcano Manor quest chain involves a series of assassination targets who are described in their invasion notes with details that paint them as interesting characters in their own right. The targets are other Tarnished, individuals who are also wandering the lands between seeking the Elden Ring. And the notes about them are written with a specificity that suggests real histories. One target is described as a Tarnished who has given up on the Elden Ring and simply wanders without purpose. Another is described as someone who has abandoned their quest to live quietly. The game gives you reasons to feel the weight of killing them, even as the Volcano Manor presents the assassinations as a routine service, which is a quiet ethical complication dropped into what could have been a simple questline. Fact 25. Patches the Untethered appears in Elden Ring as he has appeared in many FromSoftware games as a charming rogue who will trick you, rob you, feel immediately guilty about it, and then apologize while offering to sell you the items he stole. He is one of the most consistent characters across FromSoftware's catalogue, appearing in multiple Souls games and always occupying roughly the same role. In Elden Ring, his lore is consistent with this archetype, but there is a small detail in his questline that points toward a genuine, if complicated, kindness beneath the roguish exterior. He describes himself as someone who survives by taking from others, but draws a line at murder, and his interactions with other NPCs across the game suggest that he forms real connections even when he is simultaneously exploiting people. He is one of the most human characters in the game, precisely because his morality is functional and inconsistent in ways that feel recognizable. Fact 26. Miriel, Pastor of Vows, the enormous turtle who tends to the Church of Vows, is described in the game's lore as having served in the church since before the Shattering. His age is implied to be extraordinary, placing him in the same era as the events that set the game's story into motion. He accepts any sin for absolution without judgment, which is framed as a spiritual position, but also reads as the philosophical stance of someone who has seen enough history to understand that moral condemnation is rarely the most useful response to human failing. He is also simply one of the most beloved characters in the game because he is a giant friendly turtle who is enormously polite and calls you good Tarnished. And sometimes that is enough. Fact 27. The Dung Eater is one of the most unpleasant characters in Elden Ring, and that is clearly intentional. He is a Tarnished whose obsession is with defiling the corpses of others in a way that prevents them from accessing the grace of the Erd Tree and death, specifically in order to curse their lineage. His lore is deliberately repulsive, but there is a reading of his character that connects him to one of the game's endings in a way that is philosophically interesting. The Mending Rune of the Fell Curse, which his questline unlocks as an ending option, represents a world in which the Golden Order is rebuilt on a foundation of shared suffering and ugliness, rather than golden grace and beauty. It is the game's most nihilistic ending option, but the item description of the Mending Rune frames it as a kind of honesty. The idea that a system built on acknowledging the ugliness of existence might be more durable than one that pretends it away. The game does not endorse this reading, but it presents it seriously. Fact 28. The Elden Ring features 6 possible endings, each of which represents a different philosophical stance toward the question of how the world should be governed after the events of the game. The Elden Lord endings, of which there are several variants, all involve repairing the Elden Ring and restoring the Erdtree's order, but they differ in whose Mending Rune is used, and therefore what principles the restored order is built on. The Age of Fracture ending, which is the most basic version, involves restoring things roughly as they were. The Age of Duskborn ending uses Fear's Mending Rune to reintroduce death to a world that had been moving toward deathlessness. The Age of Order ending uses Goldmask's Mending Rune to repair the Golden Order according to a more complete understanding of its mathematical ideal. Each of these represents not just a gameplay choice, but a genuine philosophical position about what the world needs, and the game is careful not to tell you which one is correct. Fact 29. Goldmask is a silent NPC whose questline involves one of the more unusual forms of communication in the game. He communicates only through the gestures he makes with his body, and you must interpret his poses and then bring the results of your interpretation to his companion brother Corhin, who serves as a translator and scholar, trying to understand what Goldmask is trying to express. What Goldmask is working toward over the course of his questline is a mathematical proof of the true nature of the Golden Order, a rational formulation of divine law that corrects the errors built into the current system. His Mending Rune is described as the product of this lifelong intellectual work, and the ending associated with it is one of the more optimistic options available, suggesting a world governed by a more rigorous and honest understanding of divine order. He never speaks, and his entire characterization is delivered through implication, which makes him one of the most interesting characters in the game to read. Fact 30. Fear the Deathbed Companion is a figure who carries multiple layers of meaning in her lore. She is a woman who offers to hold tarnished warriors, and when she holds you, she gives you a blessing, but also takes a small portion of your vitality. This is described as a service she provides, a form of intimacy and comfort offered to those who have died and will die again, which resonates with the tarnished's condition of repeated death through the respawn mechanic. Fear's deeper purpose involves the body of Godwyn, the first demigod to truly die, whose corpse has been kept beneath the capital. She is tending to the process by which Godwyn's death might eventually produce a new rune of death, one that could restore a proper relationship between life and death to a world that has grown increasingly deathless under the Erdtree's influence. Her ending, the Age of Duskborn, is one of the most poignant because it is built on the premise that death is not an enemy but a necessary part of a healthy world, and that the Golden Order's attempt to minimize and control death has done more harm than good. Fact 31. The concept of grace in Elden Ring is one of the game's most interesting philosophical constructs. Grace is described as something the Erdtree bestows on the living, a connection to the divine that sustains people and allows them to continue after death if they are tarnished. The sites of grace that you rest at throughout the game are described as emanations of this force, places where the Erdtree's influence is particularly concentrated. But the game also suggests that grace can be misused or faked, and several characters in the game are described as having the appearance of grace without the genuine article. The Formless Mother, who is the outer god associated with Mog, offers something that resembles grace, but is described as a bloody imitation, a substitute that confers power at the cost of corruption. This distinction between genuine grace and its simulacra is one of the ways the game invites you to think critically about which powers you are aligning yourself with and what those alliances actually cost. Fact 32. Mong, Lord of Blood, is one of the demigods whose lore involves the most explicit connection to an outer god. He is described as having been chosen by the Formless Mother, an outer god associated with blood and suffering, who granted him power in exchange for his devotion. Mog's plan involves using that power to establish a dynasty, specifically by kidnapping Miquella and attempting to use him as a vessel for divine authority to legitimize a new order. What makes Mog's story genuinely strange is that Miquella, throughout the entire ordeal, appears to be asleep. He is described as having put himself into a long sleep inside his cocoon, and the game leaves open the question of whether he was aware of what Mog was doing and chose not to resist it, or whether he was simply unconscious. The Miquella lore that has been expanded in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC adds considerable complexity to this, but the base game presents it as a tableau of devotion so intense it becomes possession. Fact 33. Miquella the Unalloyed is described as the most powerful of the Empyreans, beings who have the potential to become gods in the manner that Marika became a god. He is also described as Malenia's twin, and the two of them are connected in the lore as children born with particular afflictions, Malenia with the scarlet rot, and Miquella with a growth curse that prevents him from aging beyond the appearance of a child. Miquella's response to these afflictions was not to accept them, but to devote himself to finding cures, developing the Unalloyed gold needle and the sacred tree magic of the Halig tree in an attempt to develop remedies for his sister's rot and for his own curse. The Halig tree, which is the area where Malenia is found as a boss, was Miquella's attempt to create a new Erd tree independent of the greater will, one grown from his own blood and power. The fact that you find it broken and infested with rot by the time you visit it suggests that his plans were interrupted before they could be completed. Fact 34. The Halig tree's design is one of the most visually distinctive areas in Elden Ring. It is a massive golden tree growing in the far northern reaches of the map, accessible only through an elaborate hidden path involving secret medallion halves and a teleporter, and it houses one of the most devoted communities in the game, the Halig Tree Knights and the Clean Rot Knights who followed Malenia there. The fact that the area is decaying by the time you arrive, with rot consuming what Miquella built, is a quiet tragedy because you can see in the architecture and the details of the environment what the Halig tree was supposed to be, a sanctuary free from the Golden Order's authority and the Outer God's corruption. Malenia is there in part to guard whatever remains of it. Fact 35. The Clean Rot Knights who serve Malenia are described as warriors who chose to follow her despite knowing about her affliction with the scarlet rot. They coated their armor with special preparations to protect themselves from the rot's influence, and they trained to fight alongside a commander whose power was inseparable from a disease that could kill them. This detail points toward a loyalty that went beyond duty or politics and into something more like genuine devotion, which complicates the more straightforward reading of Malenia as simply a powerful enemy the player must overcome. Fact 36. The weapons in Elden Ring carry some of the game's most concentrated lore. The blasphemous blade, which you receive from defeating Rykard, is described as a weapon that has absorbed the blasphemous serpent's nature, to the point where it heals its user by drawing life from those it kills. This is framed as a property of the weapon rather than a magical enchantment, suggesting that the blade has been fundamentally changed by its contact with an entity that devoured a god. The description hints at a kind of ongoing hunger embedded in the weapon itself, which resonates with Rykard's philosophy of consuming and being consumed by power. Fact 37. The Dark Moon Greatsword is one of the weapons most closely associated with Ranni's lore and questline. It is described as the Sword of the Moon, created to serve as a symbol of Ranni's oath to the one who would accompany her. You receive it by completing her questline and equipping the Dark Moon ring she gives you. And the act of presenting the ring and receiving the sword is one of the game's more emotionally resonant moments, if you have followed her story through to that point. The sword is associated with the moon and with cold, which in the game's symbolism is connected to things outside the Erdtree's warmth and light, things that exist by their own light rather than reflected divinity. Fact 38. The Grafted Blade Greatsword is a weapon whose item description carries a remarkable amount of history in a very small amount of text. It is described as a blade made from many lesser blades welded together, and the description references an oath sworn by those who lost to the wielder of the original blade. The Castle Morn area where you find it is associated with the Crucible and with an ancient martial tradition, and the weapon's lore suggests that the grafting of blades together was itself a ritual act, a physical monument to a series of defeats that someone chose to carry with them permanently. The image of a warrior walking through the world with a sword made from the swords of everyone they defeated is both brutal and oddly noble. Fact 39. The Moonveil katana is one of the most popular weapons in Elden Ring's player community, but its lore is just as interesting as its gameplay. It is described as a blade made by Academy sorcerers, one that channels moonlight in a way that bridges the gap between physical cutting and pure sorcery. The Academy of Raya Lucaria, in the game's world, was devoted to an intellectual tradition that sought to understand and systematize the power of the moon and stars, in contrast to the faith-based incantation magic associated with the Erd Tree. The Moonveil represents that tradition at its most refined, a weapon that is simultaneously a physical and theoretical achievement. Fact 40. The Sword of Night and Flame is described in its lore as having been hidden away because it combined the powers of both the Sword of Night, associated with lunar sorcery, and the Sword of Flame, associated with the Erd Tree's incantations. The combination of these two magical traditions in a single weapon was apparently considered inappropriate or dangerous under the Golden Order's rules about the proper separation of magical disciplines, which adds a small piece to the broader picture of how the Golden Order attempted to control not just political power, but intellectual and magical inquiry. Fact 41. The Carian royal family, from which Rennala, Ranni, Radahn and Rykard descend on their mother's side, had a magical tradition focused on the moon and stars that predated their integration into the Golden Order through Radagon's marriage to Rennala. The Carian Manor in the game, which is one of the more visually unusual areas, and one of the few places where you fight a phantom version of Rennala as a boss, is described as the ancestral home of the Carian line, and is filled with evidence of a culture devoted to lunar magic and celestial divination. The encounter there involves fighting through Rennala's full moon sorcery, which is framed as a memory or echo rather than the genuine queen herself. The full moon that Rennala summons is described as a convergence of all lunar sorcery, and her title, the Full Moon Queen, suggests that her power was the apex of a tradition rather than an anomaly within it. Fact 42. Sellen the Sorceress is one of the NPCs who exemplifies how the Golden Order's institutional structures created and destroyed careers within the Academy of Raya Lucaria. She was exiled from the Academy for pursuing a forbidden line of research involving primordial sorcery, a tradition of magic associated with a pre-Erd Tree understanding of the stars. Her questline involves helping her recover materials to reconstitute herself after she has been subjected to a form of magical punishment, and the conclusion of her arc, regardless of which path you take, is genuinely bleak. The game seems to be making a point about how institutions punish the people who push their intellectual boundaries the furthest. Fact 43. The Academy of Raya Lucaria itself has a history that the game delivers primarily through architectural details and item descriptions. It was founded as an independent institution not affiliated with the Golden Order, and its integration into the broader political structure of the Lands Between came through Radagon's marriage to Rennala rather than through any voluntary affiliation. This means that the Academy was effectively absorbed into a power structure it had not chosen, and the cultural tensions between Carian lunar sorcery and Erd Tree faith magic were managed rather than resolved. The presence of both traditions in the Academy's architecture and magical systems points toward an institution that maintained its older identity even while formally belonging to a newer order. Fact 44. The glintstone that powers the Academy's sorceries is described in the game's lore as crystallized star matter, debris from celestial objects that has settled in the ground of the Lands Between and can be used to harness sorcerous power. Glintstone scholars like Sellen, Seluvis, and the general population of Academy mages are depicted as people who literally wear pieces of stars in their foreheads or staffs, using the substance as a conduit for cosmic energy. This is a beautiful detail that gives the Academy's aesthetic of blue crystal and starlight a material grounding in the world's cosmology. Fact 45. Seluvis is one of the most unpleasant characters in Elden Ring's NPC roster, and his role in Ranni's questline is deliberately positioned to create discomfort. He is Ranni's vassal and serves under her, but his own agenda involves collecting Tarnished, and transforming them into puppets using a potion he forces on them. His questline reveals that he attempted to do this to Nefeli Lux, the warrior woman you meet early in the game, and that Rani herself is unaware of his activities. His character study is of a person who uses their position within a larger and more legitimate power structure to pursue a private cruelty that their patron would never endorse, which is a pattern with recognizable real-world resonances. Fact 46. Nefeli Lux, the axe-wielding warrior you meet near the beginning of the game, has a personal history that connects to some of the game's most important lore through a detail that is easy to miss. Her last name, Lux, connects her to Hawara Lux, which is Godfrey, the first Elden Lord's original name from before he became Elden Lord. The game suggests that she is his daughter or descendant, which gives her questline an added weight when you consider that she is a tarnished warrior seeking the Elden Ring in a world where her ancestor was literally the first person to hold the title she is working toward. Her arc, which can end with her ruling Stormveil Castle as Lord, is one of the more hopeful NPC conclusions available. Fact 47. Kenneth Haight, one of the NPCs you encounter near the game's starting area, presents himself as a Limgrave noble who wants to reclaim Stormveil Castle and restore the hereditary rule of his family. His attitude is pompous and slightly absurd in the context of a world that has been ravaged by the Shattering, and the game plays this for gentle comedy. But his questline eventually connects with Nefeli's in a way that suggests the game has a genuine interest in what political reconstruction looks like after a catastrophe, even if the answer it arrives at is modest. Fact 48. The Shattering, the event that serves as the game's historical starting point, was a war fought between the demigods over the shards of the Elden Ring after Marika broke it. Each major shard became a great rune associated with a specific demigod, and the wars over these shards devastated the lands between in ways that are still visible everywhere you go. The ruins, the collapsed fortresses, the armies of undead soldiers still fighting battles that ended long ago. All of this is the afterimage of the Shattering. The demigods themselves were changed by their great runes in ways that the lore describes as corrupting, amplifying their existing natures to the point of madness. Godric's obsession with grafting, Morgott's bitter devotion, Rykard's blasphemous rebellion. All of these are described as amplifications of something that was already present, rather than transformations created from nothing. Fact 49. Godric the Grafted is the first major demigod boss most players encounter, and his lore is simultaneously pathetic and horrifying. He is described as the weakest of the demigods by the other characters in the game, a fact that clearly defines his personality. His response to being considered weak and inferior was to begin grafting the limbs and bodies of others onto himself, accumulating physical power through a process that the lore describes as grotesque and that the environment of Stormveil Castle makes viscerally clear. The arm he grafts onto himself in the second phase of his boss fight is the arm of the dragon he has welded to his back, which suggests that even in desperation he is still performing the logic of accumulation that defines him. His final words in his boss fight cutscene reference his ancestor Godfrey in a way that reads as the plea of someone who knows they have failed to live up to a legacy. Fact 50. The dragons of Elden Ring have a history that extends back before the Erd Tree and before the Golden Order. They are described as children of the Elden Beast, or as ancient beings predating the current age, and the Dragon Lord Placidusax is arguably the most historically significant of them. He is described as having been the Elden Lord of the Age before Marika, serving a god whose name is not mentioned and who appears to have abandoned or been destroyed, leaving Placidusax waiting in a state of temporal distortion for a god that will never return. He is found in the crumbling Farum Azula, fighting you in a space outside normal time, and his lore points toward a tragedy of devotion to an absent divinity that mirrors several other character arcs in the game. Fact 51. The Farum Azula area itself is described in the game's environmental storytelling as a place that exists in a kind of temporal suspension, its stones and buildings drifting in the sky around a central ruin that the game implies is undergoing a process of becoming that was halted before completion. The beastmen who inhabit it are ancient warriors who served the god Placidusax once worshipped, and their continued presence in the ruins, centuries or millennia after that god departed, suggests either extreme loyalty or a temporal distortion that has left them caught between moments. The storm that eternally rages in Fara Missoula is described in some sources as an environmental manifestation of the crucible energy associated with the area, which adds another layer to the sense that this place exists in a different relationship to time and order than the rest of the lands between. Fact 52. The crucible tree incantations, which you can find scattered throughout the game, are described as the oldest sorceries in the lands between, expressions of the crucible's primordial life energy. They manifest as features from an earlier state of existence, things like tails, tentacles, aspects of fire and breath that belong to creatures from before the current age. Using them feels deliberately anachronistic within the world of the game, like wielding something that the current civilization would rather pretend does not exist. The fact that they are among the more powerful incantation types available suggests that the game is making a point about the power that the Golden Order has worked to suppress or deny. Fact 53. The Ancestral Spirit questline, involving the regal ancestral spirit boss and the smaller ancestral spirits you must find and kindle before you can access the main boss, is one of the quieter but more unusual sequences in the game. The spirits are connected to an older tradition of worship that predates the Erd Tree, centered on an animistic reverence for large-horned deer that the game describes as sacred. The area where you find them, reached through the Siofa River underground region, is a massive ceremonial space that implies a civilization of considerable sophistication existed beneath the surface of the lands between, long before the current age. The spirit that you fight at the end of this sequence is massive and beautiful, and its death animation has a quality of genuine mourning that is unusual for a boss encounter. Fact 54. The Mimic Tier boss is one of the more conceptually unsettling enemies in Elden Ring. It is a boss that copies your exact appearance and loadout at the start of the fight, turning the encounter into a battle against your own reflection. The lore describes Mimic Tiers as creations of the Knight's Sacred Ground in Nokron, crafted from silver tiers that have the ability to take the shape of whatever they encounter. What makes the Mimic Tier conceptually interesting beyond the gameplay gimmick is what the lore says about their creation. They were made to model themselves on the form of a god. The game suggests that the civilization of Nokron created the Mimic Tiers as a kind of devotional act, an attempt to give form to the divine by having a substance that could perfectly mirror anything take the shape of a god. When they mirror you instead, the implication is that you are what passes for divine in their presence at that moment. Fact 55. The rune bears that appear throughout Elden Ring are described in the game's lore as animals that have absorbed so much rune energy from the Elden Ring's shattering that they have become deeply aggressive and aberrant. They are among the most dangerous non-boss enemies in the game for many players, capable of killing even well-leveled characters with a few blows, and the disproportion between their appearance and their threat is intentional. They look like large bears. They fight with the aggression of something far beyond that. The lore suggests that the rune energy they carry has fundamentally altered their behavior and physiology, without necessarily making them more intelligent, which produces a dangerous combination of animal instinct and supernatural power. Fact 56. The land octopuses and worm faces that appear in certain areas of Elden Ring are among the more visually disturbing enemy designs, and their lore connects to concepts of death and spiritual contamination that run through several of the game's thematic threads. The worm faces in particular are described as humans who were transformed by exposure to deathroot, the residue of the first death that spread from Godwyn's corpse deep underground. They have literally had their faces replaced by writhing masses of something associated with a fundamentally corrupted form of death, which is framed in the lore as a kind of spiritual pollution, rather than simply a physical disease. Fact 57. Deathroot itself is one of the items that connects several of the game's seemingly unrelated systems. You bring Deathroot to D Hunter of the Dead in exchange for incantations, and the game eventually reveals through his questline that Dee's brother Darien is the person who has been harvesting the Deathroot from those who have died with the taint of Godwyn's corrupted death. The sibling conflict between Dee and Darien mirrors, on a small scale, the larger tension in the world between those who see the altered form of death as a threat and those who see it as a resource or a sacrament. The Black Knife armor that plays a role in the conclusion of their questline ties the whole thing back to the Night of Black Knives and the moment when the current age's problems began. Fact 58. The draconic tree sentinel boss variant that you encounter outside the capital is described in the game as a guardian of the Erd Tree who has been imbued with draconic power through rituals the game does not fully explain. The general category of tree sentinels are described as warriors who have taken an oath of protection to the Erd Tree and have been transformed by that oath over time, their armor and weapons becoming golden extensions of the tree's own power. The draconic variant suggests a faction within this guardian tradition that sought to combine the Erd Tree's power with draconic might, perhaps in response to the threats posed by the Shattering. Fact 59. Erd Tree burial watchdogs are an enemy type found throughout the catacombs of the Lands Between, described as stone dogs that were created to guard the dead. Their design, which has them carrying large weapons in their mouths, is genuinely unusual for a guardian figure, and the lore suggests they were constructed during an earlier period of the Erd Tree's reign, when the management of death and burial was a more formalized institution. The catacombs they guard are described as places where the dead were kept before the Erd Tree's roots could absorb them into the cycle of grace, which adds a small but interesting piece to the picture of how the Erd Tree's system of death and rebirth was administered at the institutional level. Fact 60. The ulcerated tree spirit bosses that appear in various locations throughout the game are described as spirits of the Erd Tree that have become diseased or corrupted. Their visual design, which presents them as writhing masses of glowing tree roots taking roughly humanoid shapes, is intended to evoke both the beauty and the grotesquerie of something divine going wrong. The lore suggests that they form at the base of the Erd Tree's roots, in places where the root network has become contaminated, which, given what the game tells you about what lies at the base of the Erd Tree roots, specifically Godwyn's corpse, is an additional layer of meaning in their appearance and behavior. Fact 61. The Lanedale soldiers, who continue to fight throughout the capital city long after the political authority that created them has collapsed, are described in various item descriptions as warriors who are so devoted to their oaths that they continue to function even in the absence of anyone to give them orders. This is a pattern seen throughout the game, where loyalty becomes pathological in the absence of its object. The capital itself is preserved in a state of arrested decay, its streets still paved, its structures still standing, its soldiers still fighting, but all of it increasingly hollow because the thing that gave it meaning has been gone since the Shattering. Fact 62. The fire giants who appear in the mountaintops of the Giants region have a history that the game details with unusual specificity. They were a species of enormous fire-worshipping beings who the Golden Order waged a war of extermination against because their worship of the fell god of fire was considered incompatible with the Erd Tree's order. The last surviving fire giant, which you fight as a mandatory boss, is described as having been kept alive by the Golden Order, specifically to maintain the Fire of Ruin, a sacred flame associated with the fell god that was kept burning at the top of the mountains as a kind of trophy or contingency. The fire giant is therefore both a prisoner and a guardian, kept alive in chains for purposes that serve those who destroyed his people. The boss encounter feels genuinely sad if you approach it with that context in mind. Fact 63. The Fire of Ruin that the fire giant guards is also connected to the game's central narrative through the Forge of the Giants, which is where you must travel to burn the Erd Tree and gain access to the Erd Tree's interior. The act of using the fire giant's sacred flame to burn the Erd Tree is one of the more loaded moments in the game's story, because you are using the holy fire of a people the Golden Order destroyed to assault the Golden Order's most sacred symbol. Whether that reads as poetic justice or as a desecration depends on your perspective, but the game clearly intends the parallel. Fact 64. The fell god associated with fire in Elden Ring's cosmology is distinct from the frenzied flame, though both are associated with destructive and chaotic forms of fire. The fell god appears to be an entity worshipped by the ancient giants, and its relationship to the broader cosmology of outer gods is not fully explained in the base game. What the game does suggest is that the Golden Order's war against the fire giants was motivated at least in part by a desire to eliminate a rival religious tradition with real power behind it, rather than by any genuine threat that the giants posed to ordinary people. Fact 65. The Lands Between's geography contains a number of areas that are only accessible through indirect means. and the game uses this to control when you encounter certain parts of its history. The consecrated snowfield, which requires both halves of the Haligtree medallion to access, is described as a sacred area that was deliberately hidden. The blizzard that covers it is not natural, but is a magical barrier that the game implies was created to protect the path to the Haligtree from casual discovery. The effort required to get there, which involves solving a puzzle that most players find by accident or through outside research, means that the community associated with the Haligtree was genuinely attempting to remain separate from the broader conflicts of the Shattering era. Fact 66. Latenna the Albinoric is an NPC whose questline involves escorting her spirit to the Haligtree, where she hopes to find the other half of her people who travelled there before her. She is an Albinoric, a race of artificial people created by the Academy of Raya Lucaria, and her people are the subject of both persecution in the broader world and a fragile hope associated with Miquella's sanctuary. Her questline is quiet and takes a very long time to resolve, requiring you to travel the full length of the game before you can complete it, and the payoff is understated, a reunion that happens off-screen and is confirmed only by an item she leaves you. It is the kind of storytelling that rewards patience. Fact 67. The Albinoric race in the game's lore is described as having been created by scholars attempting to produce artificial life, and 2 generations of them are described in different item texts. The first generation walked upright and appeared more human in shape. The second generation, from which Latenna comes, were born without legs from the waist down and moved using their hands, which the game explains is the result of a failed refinement of the creation process. The 2 generations are described as treating each other as kin despite their differences, and both are subject to persecution by a world that considers them not fully human. The Albinoric village that you can find near the beginning of the game, and which is attacked during Nefeli's questline, is one of the more immediately tragic environmental stories in the game. Fact 68. The Great Rune system in Elden Ring is the mechanic that connects the demigod boss encounters to the game's broader lore framework. When you defeat a demigod and receive their Great Rune, you must activate it at a specific divine tower before it confers any benefit. The requirement to climb to a divine tower and commune with the energies there is described in the lore as the process of having the rune recognized by the Erdtree's network, which is a reminder that even the power you take from defeated demigods is still filtered through the Golden Order's existing infrastructure. You are not escaping the system, you are moving through it. Fact 69. Godric's Great Rune is the most straightforward mechanically, but has an interesting lore note in its item description, which mentions that it is the most diluted of the Great Runes, because Godric is the most distantly related to Marika among the demigods. This is the game encoding his social inferiority into the mechanics of his power, a detail that reinforces the character portrait without requiring any additional cutscene or dialogue. Fact 70. The Divine Towers themselves are described as structures that predate the Erdtree, or at least predate the current age of the Golden Order, that were repurposed as part of the network that maintains the Elden Ring's connection to the world. Their architectural style is distinct from the Erdtree's golden aesthetic, suggesting they were built by a civilization that had different materials and different goals. The fact that they still function after the Shattering, when so much of the Erdtree's infrastructure has broken down, suggests they are built on principles more durable than the Golden Order's own constructions. Fact 71. The demi-human races that appear throughout the game, the small ape-like creatures you find in various wilderness areas, are described in the lore as distant relatives of humanity who took a different evolutionary or magical path. They have their own communities, hierarchies, and magical practitioners, and the game depicts them as fully realized societies rather than simply as enemy mobs. The demi-human queen bosses that serve as leaders for these communities are described as having sorcerous knowledge developed independently of the Academy, which points toward multiple parallel traditions of magical practice existing outside the Golden Order's sanctioned institutions. Fact 72. The crucible of life that Godwyn's corruption has created beneath the capital, which the game calls the Prince of Death's throne, is one of the most striking environmental details in the game's underground areas. Godwyn's body has grown roots, literally becoming a part of the landscape, and the area around it is filled with the half-life that results from a being whose body lives but whose soul is dead. The visual design of this area, with enormous root structures and a body that has spread beyond the confines of any human form, is one of the game's clearest visual statements about what happens when death is incomplete and improperly resolved. Fact 73. Enia the Finger Reader, who operates at the Round Table Hold, is one of the characters who provides the most accessible lore information in the game, because her role is to translate the great runes you bring her and provide context for the demigods who held them. Her readings of the runes are written with a formality and reverence that suggests she is reciting information she has received from the two fingers, rather than information she has gathered independently, which means her accounts of the demigods are filtered through the Greater Will's perspective. This is worth bearing in mind when you consider that the Greater Will's perspective is not necessarily accurate or sympathetic. Fact 74. The Round Table Hold itself is described as a place outside the normal geography of the lands between, a space that exists in a kind of extra-dimensional location, accessible only through the guidance of grace. Its purpose as a gathering point for Tarnished, who are seeking the Elden Ring, makes it a kind of neutral ground, and the NPCs who inhabit it are all figures who have chosen to situate themselves in relation to the quest without fully committing to it. Several of them have their own reasons to be there, and the Round Table becomes the setting for several significant NPC questline events that you would never stumble on unless you regularly return to it. Fact 75. The two fingers at the Round Table Hold are described in a way that suggests they are old and weakened, perhaps because the shattering damaged the communication channels between the Greater Will and its intermediaries. They communicate only in broken fragments, which is why Enia is needed to interpret them. The sense of a divine system that was once clear and functional and is now crumbling and partial is one of the game's persistent background notes, and the two fingers embody it more literally than almost any other element. Fact 76. Bernal the Volcano Mannonite is one of the NPCs you can encounter both as a cooperative NPC in certain boss fights and as an invader in a specific late-game location. His questline and dialogue reveal a character who has moved through multiple allegiances, from Tarnished seeking the Elden Ring to Volcano Manor Assassin, and his final appearance as an invader in the Farum Azula suggests that by the end of his story, he has arrived at a place of nihilistic purpose, using the combat skills he has accumulated in service of nothing in particular. He is one of several characters in the game whose arc ends not in resolution, but in a kind of purposeful desolation. Fact 77. The remembrance items you receive from defeating major bosses are worth examining closely, because their descriptions often provide the most direct character assessments in the game. The remembrance of the Grafted describes Godric's power as a reflection of all who have fallen to him, which is a fairly damning portrait. The remembrance of the Starscourge describes Radahn's power as shaped by both his strength and his love of the stars, which is much more sympathetic. The asymmetry between these descriptions points toward the game's consistent differentiation between characters who took power and characters who developed it. Fact 78. The Flame of Frenzy ending, which is one of the more extreme options available to the player, involves allowing the frenzied flame to inhabit your body completely and then using it to incinerate the Erd Tree. The visuals of this ending are genuinely disturbing, involving the player character transformed into something barely recognizable as human, and the lore associated with the frenzied flame describes it as the opposite force to the Erd Tree's order, an equalizing chaos that seeks to reduce all things to their original, undifferentiated state. The game frames this as genuinely destructive rather than liberating, but it does not moralize about it. The three fingers simply offer what they offer, and you choose. Fact 79. To undo the frenzied flame ending, you can use an item called Miquella's Needle, which requires defeating Malenia to obtain. The needle is described as something Miquella created specifically to resist the Outer God's influence, including the frenzied flame. The fact that the cure for the most extreme of the game's endings is hidden behind the game's hardest optional boss is either a piece of brilliant game design or a remarkably elaborate joke at the expense of completionists, and possibly both. Fact 80. Millicent, one of the most beloved NPCs in Elden Ring, is described in the game's lore as a young woman infected with the Scarlet Rot, who carries a special mutation that makes her partially resistant to its worst effects. She is described in the game's hints as potentially being one of Melinia's children, a possibility supported by item descriptions and questline details that draw parallels between her physical condition and Melinia's. Her questline is a long and winding journey that ends in multiple possible ways depending on your choices. And it is one of the game's more emotionally affecting stories, because it follows a person trying to live a meaningful life in the shadow of a disease she did not choose. Fact 81. The unalloyed gold needle that plays a central role in Millicent's questline and in the frenzied flame reversal is described as one of Miquella's most remarkable creations, a material that resists the influence of all outer gods and can be used to suppress their power. The idea that someone in the world of Elden Ring developed a material specifically designed to counteract divine influence is one of the more radical things the lore contains, and it resonates with Miquella's broader project of trying to create a world not governed by any external god. Fact 82. The imprisoned merchant who appears in several cave systems throughout the lands between is a character whose lore is delivered almost entirely through incidental dialogue. He is found in cages and makes it clear he considers himself imprisoned, but he is also willing to sell you items. The implication is that he was imprisoned for something he knows, or something he did, and the items he sells, which are occasionally unusual or rare, suggest he has access to knowledge and goods that the normal world does not sanction. He is a small piece of a broader pattern in the game, where the people who are outside the system, literally or figuratively, sometimes have access to things the system cannot provide. Fact 83. The smithing master Iji, the giant blacksmith, who serves Ranni and can be found at Road's End, near the beginning of the game, has a long personal history that the game delivers through questline events rather than through direct exposition. He is described as having served in past wars, and his affection for Blade and Ranni is evident in his dialogue. His role in Ranni's questline and its aftermath, which ends with him performing a specific task on her behalf that costs him dearly, is one of the game's quieter acts of loyalty. A huge and ancient figure doing a terrible thing because his lady asked him to. Fact 84. Blade the Half-Wolf is one of the most visually striking characters in Elden Ring, a massive figure who appears human from the waist up and wolf-like in his dark fur and howl, and whose questline is one of the longer and more involved NPC stories in the game. He is described as Ranni's shadow, a guardian created specifically to serve and protect her, and his loyalty to her is the defining fact of his existence. What makes his story tragic is that the mechanism that created him, the force that made him her loyal guardian, is also what eventually drives him to madness when her choices take her outside the scope of what his programming can accommodate. His final appearance in the game is as a hostile figure you must fight, not because he wants to harm you, but because something in him has broken and he cannot do otherwise. Fact 85. The Three Sisters, the geographical area where Ranni's Rise, Renna's Rise, and Seluvis's Rise are located, is described as a place of particular significance to the Carian royal family. The three towers are associated with three magical practitioners, all connected to Ranni's network of allies and servants. And the area as a whole has the feel of a private and protected space, separated from the rest of the Leonia Plateau by the Carian Manor's defences. It is one of several enclosed spaces in the game that feels like a community existing at a deliberate remove from the broader world. Fact 86. The Stargazer ruins that appear in several locations across the lands between are described as remnants of a culture devoted to astronomical study, connecting to the tradition of celestial observation that the Academy built on, and that the underground civilizations practiced in their own way. The ruined telescopes and observation equipment found in these locations point toward a time when the study of the sky was a significant intellectual and perhaps spiritual pursuit, one that the subsequent consolidation of power around the Erd Tree may have discouraged or absorbed into more institutionalized forms. Fact 87. Nokron, the Eternal City, which you reach by defeating Radahn and allowing the meteor he was holding back to fall, is described as a city of immense age and sophistication that exists deep underground. Its residents, the Silver Tears and the ancestral followers and various other entities, represent a civilization that was contemporary with the earliest days of the Erdtree's power. The city's aesthetic, which combines organic cave environments with elaborate humanoid architecture and star-filled ceiling voids, is one of the most distinctive in the game, and the Finger Slayer blade you find there is described as something crafted by residents who understood the two fingers well enough to build a weapon designed to kill them. Fact 88. The Ainsel River underground region, which is distinct from Siofra River and Nokron, is where Ranni's questline takes you at a key moment, with a miniature version of Ranni riding in a coffin that you carry with you. The underground areas of the game often serve as containers for older history, and the Ainsel River is no exception, holding remnants of civilizations and conflicts that predate the surface world's current configuration. The presence of the Black Knife assassin boss in this area, and the lore associated with it, adds another layer to the Knight of Black Knives narrative. Fact 89. The Lake of Rot, which is accessed through the Ainsel River underground system, is one of the more punishing environments in the game mechanically, being a vast underground sea of scarlet rot that damages you simply by standing in it. The lore associated with the lake suggests it formed as a consequence of the spread of the rot from somewhere deep in the underground network, and its presence beneath the lands between points toward the outer god of rot's influence being older and more pervasive than just Malenia's condition suggests. Fact 90. The natural born of the Void Boss, encountered in Nokstella, is one of the more cosmologically unsettling entities in the game. It appears to be a creature from a void space associated with the outer gods, or with the space between them, and its design, which presents it as a mass of distorted geometry and alien shapes, suggests something that does not originate in the normal physical world. The game does not provide extensive lore for it, which is consistent with how the game treats the void spaces associated with outer gods as something deliberately obscure and unknowable. Fact 91. The Astal natural born of the void that appears later in the game in the depths of the Grand Cloister is described in its remembrance as a meteor beast that fell from the void between the stars and devastated a city by destroying its sky. This is described as the event that destroyed Nokstella and explains why the underground city that should be there is in ruins. The Astel is therefore not just a boss, but a historical calamity made manifest, something that fell from outside the known cosmology and broke something irreplaceable. Fact 92. The Starfist weapon, which you can receive from defeating the Astel boss, is described as a weapon made from a fragment of the meteor that Astel crashed to Earth in, imbued with the same void energy that makes the Astel's own attack so disorienting. The idea of crafting a weapon from the debris of a cosmic catastrophe is consistent with the game's general approach to its item lore, which tends to ground even the most fantastical objects in a chain of causation that connects them to specific historical events. Fact 93. The gloom-eyed Queen Marika statue that appears in several locations throughout the game is a version of Marika that differs subtly from the more common depictions. While the standard Marika statues present her with an expression of serene authority, the gloom-eyed Queen statues, which are associated with the destined death power that was removed from the Elden Ring and stored in Malekith, present her in a more ambiguous light. The gloam-eyed Queen may be a distinct identity or epithet associated with Marika's role as Keeper of Destined Death before that power was sealed away, and the visual distinction between the two statue types points toward a deliberate historical revision. Fact 94. Malekith, the Black Blade, is one of the most significant boss encounters in terms of its narrative function. He is Marika's shadow, a beast of immense power who was tasked with sealing away the rune of death within his own body, after the Knight of Black Knives demonstrated how dangerous it could be if allowed to circulate freely. He is described as having been devoted to this task at the cost of everything else, carrying the rune of death within him and accepting the role of its prison. His defeat at the hands of the player releases the rune of death back into the world, which is what allows the Erd tree to be burned and the story to proceed toward its conclusion. He is, structurally, a lock that you must break to open the final chapter of the game. Fact 95. The Sentry's Torch, which reveals invisible Black Knife assassins during one of the game's most technically demanding optional encounters, is an item that rewards players who explore thoroughly and read item descriptions. It is described as having been created specifically to detect the presence of the Black Knife assassins, developed by forces that survived the Night of Black Knives and wanted to prevent another such attack. The existence of this item points toward the political and intelligence work that must have gone on in the aftermath of the Night of Black Knives, a broader history of consequence and response that the game mostly leaves to the imagination. Fact 96. Commander Nile, the boss found in Castle Sol in the mountain tops of the Giants, is described as an ancient veteran whose legs were destroyed in battle and were replaced with the legs of knights who died serving under him. He fights with these spectral knight legs as summoned spirits, which is one of the more unusual visual elements in the game's boss design, and one that has a straightforward lore explanation. His item drop and boss room both suggest a figure of genuine historical importance, whose story has been reduced to its final, broken chapter. Fact 97. Castle Sol itself is associated with the commander of the Solar Knights, a warrior tradition connected to the Erd Tree's light in a more direct way than most of the game's knight factions. The castle guards the Halig Tree secret medallion item that you need to access the consecrated snowfield, and the difficulty of reaching and completing it is part of the game's design to make millennia genuinely optional for most players' first playthroughs. Fact 98. The spirit calling bell mechanic, which allows you to summon the spirits of creatures you have encountered as combat allies, is described in the game's lore as a form of magic practiced by Erd Tree witches. The bell itself is described as a tool for drawing out the spirits that cling to the physical world after death, and the art of spirit summoning is positioned as a distinct magical tradition with its own history and practitioners. Roderica, the NPC who eventually becomes the spirit toner at the Round Table Hold, is described as having an unusual natural affinity for communicating with spirits, and her questline involves developing this natural gift into a practical skill. Fact 99. Roderica's initial characterization, as a frightened young woman sitting in a ruined shack who seems paralyzed by the horrors around her, is one of the more honest depictions of how a person might actually respond to the circumstances of Elden Ring's world. Her development over the course of the game from this paralysis into a confident and capable practitioner is one of the more straightforward, positive character arcs available. And the fact that it happens almost entirely through small conversational moments at the Round Table Hold, rather than through grand quests, gives it a quality of ordinary growth that is unusual for the genre. Fact 100. The Spirit Ashes system in general is one of the more interesting gameplay elements for lore purposes, because each spirit has its own description that reveals something about who or what it was in life. The Dung Eater puppet's description, if you complete Celovus's questline along a certain path, is one of the more disturbing examples, noting that the puppet retains echoes of the original's personality. The Latenna spirit, meanwhile, has a description that references her wolf companion Lobo, in a way that adds weight to her story if you have completed her questline and understand what she gave up. Fact 101. The grafted scion that serves as the game's first enemy encounter, appearing immediately after the game's opening cinematic and being almost certainly strong enough to kill any new player in seconds, is described in the lore as a creature of Godric's creation, an amalgam of stolen limbs similar to Godric himself, but without the demigod's individuality. It serves as both a gameplay tutorial in the sense of teaching the player that death is not a permanent failure, and as a thematic statement about what kind of world this is. You die to this creature not as a narrative failure, but as your introduction to the cycle of death and return that defines the Tarnished's experience. Fact 102. The tree sentinel who blocks the road at the beginning of the game is a similar design choice, an obviously too powerful enemy placed in your path early on as a statement of the game's philosophy. He is not a trap. He is a signal. The game is telling you through his existence that the path forward is not always the right path right now, and that learning to read the landscape for information about what you can and cannot yet handle is a skill you will need. His lore, as a guardian of the Erd Tree, is straightforward, but his role in the experience of playing the game is almost purely pedagogical. Fact 103. The Fell Twins boss that appears in the Altus Plateau is described in the game as a pair of omens who serve as guardians of the approach to the capital city. Their design, which presents them as grotesque but powerfully built warriors bearing the marks of their omen heritage, is one of the game's clearest visual statements about the contradiction between omen nature and omen status. They are obviously formidable and capable warriors who have been relegated to the role of gatekeepers, their strength acknowledged in their function, while their nature is treated as a disqualification for anything more dignified. Fact 104. The Crucible Night bosses, which appear throughout the game in various locations, are described as the oldest of the Erdtree's knights, warriors who predate the formalization of the Golden Order and who venerate the crucible of life that existed before the Erdtree's dominance. Their armor and weapon designs reference an older aesthetic than the golden filigree of the current age, and their boss fights are among the more technically demanding in the game, their seriousness of design consistent with their status as figures from an era the current world has largely forgotten. Fact 105. The Godskin Noble and Godskin Apostle enemies, and their combination boss formed the Godskin Duo, are among the more visually unusual enemy designs in the game. They are described as members of the Godskin faction, which was at some historical point tasked with killing gods using weapons made from the skins of slain deities. The lore around this faction is dense and disturbing, pointing toward a history of divine violence that predates the current age. The Knights Cavalry, which appears differently and is associated with a different tradition, shares some of this historical weight. Fact 106. The black flame that the Godskin Apostles use in combat is described in the game as a fire capable of killing gods, a flame developed from the concept of destined death that burns away divine essence rather than physical matter. The idea that a group of practitioners developed and maintained a tradition of god-killing magic as a professional discipline is one of the more unsettling pieces of lore in the game, and the fact that this faction appears to still be operating during the events of the game, long after the political circumstances that created them have changed, suggests an organization that has outlasted its original mandate. Fact 107. The Dragon Communion mechanic, which allows you to eat dragon hearts in exchange for incantations, is described in the game's lore as a practice with genuine religious significance in the dragon-worshipping communities that exist on the Dragon Barrow and in the Cathedral of Dragon Communion. The act of consuming a dragon's power is framed not as mere theft, but as a form of communion in the religious sense, taking the essence of a powerful being into yourself as a devotional act. Several of the incantations you gain through this system reference the specific dragons whose power you are channeling, giving them individual identities. Fact 108. Exyx, one of the named dragons you encounter in the Caelid region, is described in his lore as a dragon who has become afflicted with the scarlet rot, having inhaled it from the corruption that now defines Caelid's environment. He is no longer the dragon he was, and his Dragon Communion incantation reflects this, channeling a form of breath weapon that combines draconic fire with scarlet rot. He is presented as a tragic figure, rather than simply an obstacle, a great and ancient creature brought low by an environmental catastrophe he did not cause. Fact 109. The Borealis, the freezing fog boss in the mountaintops of the Giants region, is described as an ancient dragon associated with cold and fog, whose territory is the frozen peaks above the bulk of the game's content. His item text does not provide as much characterization as some of the named dragons, but his presence in the most isolated and inhospitable part of the game's surface world suggests a creature that has existed in that extreme environment for an enormous span of time, long enough that the cold itself seems to have become inseparable from his nature. Fact 110. The dragon Grandsax, whose enormous body decorates the walls of Leyndell in the form of a massive spear buried in his side, is described in the lore as having once attacked the capital in the ancient past. The spear that killed him is the ancient dragon's lightning strike weapon that you can find during your exploration of Leyndell, and the scale of Grandsax's body, which is visible as an environmental feature rather than as a boss encounter, gives you a sense of how ancient and enormous this creature was. He has been dead for so long that the capital was built around his corpse, as though he were a geographical feature. Fact 111. Lanciax, another named dragon, is encountered as a boss in the Altus Plateau region and is described as one of the ancient dragons who sided with the Erdtree rather than opposing it. Her incantation, Lanciax's glaive, references a specific form of lightning that belongs to the ancient draconic tradition, and her willingness to engage with the Golden Order's alliance with Dragonkind suggests a more complex history of relations between the two civilizations than the extermination of the fire giants might suggest. Fact 112. The Dragon Temple in the Fera Missoula area contains evidence of an ancient draconic civilization that predates the Golden Order, with architectural remains that suggest the dragons had their own formal structures and hierarchies before the current age. The beastmen who inhabit these ruins are their servitors, creatures of a similar ancient origin who maintained the temple and its traditions even after the broader context that gave them meaning was lost. The sense of something vast and old, having wound down to almost nothing, is one of the most persistent emotional notes in that area of the game. Fact 113. Sir Gideon Ofnir the All-Knowing is an NPC at the Round Table Hold who presents himself as the most informed and knowledgeable of the Tarnished seeking the Elden Ring. He is described as having connections and information networks that allow him to know things other characters do not, and his questline involves him gradually coming to a conclusion that the quest itself is ultimately futile. His appearance as a boss late in the game, positioned as a final test before you reach the Erd Tree, involves him presenting every form of knowledge he has gathered as a weapon against you, which is a somewhat bitter metaphor for the game's relationship with excessive preparation. Fact 114. Godfrey's second encounter, in Lanedell after you have burned the Erd Tree and the capital is covered in ash, is one of the most narratively significant boss fights in the game. By this point, Godfrey has returned to the Lands Between in response to the Call of Grace, restored to his original identity as Hawara Lux after the grace he was deprived of returns to him. His second boss phase, in which he abandons his weapons and fights you barehanded as Hawara Lux, is described in his dialogue as a kind of release. He discards the civilized warrior persona of Godfrey and returns to the primal berserker he was before Marika elevated him. Whether this reads as regression or liberation is up to the player, but Godfrey himself seems to find it joyful. Fact 115. The Elden Beast final boss is preceded by Radagon, and the juxtaposition of these two encounters is deliberate. You fight Radagon, who represents a person who devoted himself entirely to the Golden Order's ideals, and then you fight the Golden Order made literal and physical. Defeating both of them is the act of ending an age, and the game frames it not as a heroic victory exactly, but as a completion of a process set in motion long before your arrival. You did not break the world. You inherited the task of dealing with what breaking the world produced. Fact 116. The Elden Beast's design is one of the more visually complex boss designs in the game, combining elements of a large aquatic creature with starfields and golden light in ways that are intended to communicate both its alien origin and its deep connection to the Erd Tree. Its attack patterns involve creating constellations and using the Elden Ring itself as a weapon, and several of its attacks are described in community research as referencing specific astronomical features, which is consistent with the idea that it is literally made of star matter. Fact 117. The Frenzied Flame Prescription area, where you can receive the mark of the three fingers, is one of the more difficult places to reach in the game, requiring you to strip completely naked and descend through a series of hidden passages beneath the capital. The ritual of stripping yourself of all your equipment is described as the act of making yourself empty enough to receive the flame, which is consistent with the Frenzied Flame's cosmological role as something that seeks to reduce all distinctions and all differentiation to nothing. To receive it, you must first give up everything that makes you individually yourself. Fact 118. The Tarnished's general condition of dying and returning is described in the game's lore as a consequence of being disconnected from the Erd Tree's grace. Normal people who die return to the Erd Tree's cycle and do not retain memory of their death. Tarnished die outside this system and must fight their way back through sheer determination, which is what gives them their mechanical property of being able to respawn. The game frames this not as an advantage, but as a curse, the inability to properly die or rest being described in various NPC dialogues as a burden rather than a gift. Fact 119. Vike Knight of the Round Table is a Tarnished who appears in the game's lore as someone who came closer than any other to claiming the title of Elden Lord before the player character. His story, which is delivered through his invasion appearances and item descriptions rather than direct dialogue, is of a person who was undone at the final moment by his encounter with the three fingers and the frenzied flame. He carries the mark of the flame and wanders the world as an invader, attacking other tarnished in a state that the lore implies is not fully voluntary. He is one of the game's most direct arguments for the danger of the frenzied flame path. Fact 120. The Tarnished Who Returns invasion event in Writhed Ruins involves a named Tarnished who can invade you wearing the festive rag, and whose item drops suggest a person who was once a noble or dignified figure, who has been reduced to wandering and combat. Named invasion characters like this are one of the game's quieter ways of populating its world with personal histories, individuals who are not major characters, but who clearly had lives and stories that ended in the specific moment you encounter them. Fact 121. Alexander the Iron Fist is one of the most beloved NPCs in Elden Ring, and his questline is a simple story of perseverance and growth that stands in vivid contrast to many of the game's more tragic NPC arcs. He is a large jar man, a member of a race of people who live inside large ceramic pots, and who are described as having chosen this existence as a way of honoring the warriors whose remains were placed inside jars as part of burial traditions. Alexander wants to become stronger by absorbing the remains of the powerful, and his questline takes him across much of the game's geography in pursuit of this goal. His final encounter is a genuine duel between you and him, which he requests because he considers you strong enough to give him a worthy death and therefore the greatest possible gift. Fact 122. The Jarites who created the Jar people are described as craftspeople who developed a tradition of honoring the dead by placing their remains in vessels, with the living Jar people being a refinement of this practice. Vessels that moved and thought and carried the strength of those inside them. This gives the Jar people a lore that is simultaneously touching and strange, making them into living monuments to the concept of inherited strength. Fact 123. Dialis Hoslow and his brother Juno Hoslow are connected to one of the Volcano Manor assassination assignments, and their story is a tragedy of family loyalty and pride that plays out in the background of the main questline. Dialis' attempts to do right by his family and his eventual recognition that his efforts have ended badly are delivered with a restraint that makes them more affecting. His final quest state, depending on how you engage with it, leaves him in a state of quiet desolation that is one of the game's more understated character endings. Fact 124. The Knights Cavalry that appear in various locations across the lands between, riding spectral horses and attacking travelers at night, are described as ancient warriors who once served as guards of the roads under the Erdtree's authority, and who have continued their patrol in a ghostly form long after their living purpose ended. They are one of several enemy types in the game that represent the persistence of duty past the point where the duty has any meaning, institutions continued by muscle memory in the absence of any governing will. Fact 125. The Fell Omen Cloak and related items associated with Morgoth suggest a figure who maintained a complex relationship with his own monstrous appearance. He concealed himself extensively, but also kept his nature close, aware of what he was in a way that prevented him from fully pretending otherwise. His boss room, filled with the evidence of his presence in the capital over a long period, suggests a king who ruled without a kingdom, protecting a throne he could never occupy. Fact 126. The Elden Star's incantation, which is one of the rarest in the game and requires reaching an extremely out-of-the-way location, is described as the most ancient of the Erdtree's incantations, a prayer that calls upon the primordial light that existed before the Elden Ring was given its form. Using it sends a cascade of golden light across the screen that functions as an area clearing attack, and its rarity and power in gameplay terms is consistent with the lore suggestion that it represents something foundational and very old. Fact 127. The Carian Regal Scepter and related Carian magic items provide additional texture to the history of the Carian royal family and their unique magical tradition. The scepter is described as having been Renala's personal instrument, and its item description touches on the quality of full moon sorcery that characterized her work at the height of her power, before the Shattering and Radagon's departure. Items like this serve as archaeological fragments in the game's lore structure, pieces of a history you can assemble by paying attention. Fact 128. The golden epitaph sword, found on a body in a Reza hero's grave, is described as having been commissioned by Morgoth for his father Godfrey. The inscription references their relationship in terms that are simultaneously formal and tender, which is one of the more touching details in the game, given Morgoth's overall characterization as a bitter figure who loves a system that never loved him. His commissioning of a gift for a father who was exiled before Morgoth was even born points toward a capacity for connection and feeling that his public presentation largely conceals. Fact 129. The Crucible Feather Talisman and its companions, the Crucible Scale and Crucible Knot Talismans, are all described as embodying aspects of the primordial crucible, the unformed life state that the game's lore treats as something older and in some ways truer than the current age. The fact that these talismans exist as practical and valued items within the game suggests that knowledge of and appreciation for the Crucible persisted quietly within the world, even as the official culture suppressed it. Fact 130. The Radagon Icon Talisman is described in a way that references Radagon's exceptional magical aptitude, specifically noting that he could manifest his sorceries faster than any other practitioner. This detail adds something to the portrait of Radagon as a person. He was not only devoted to the Golden Order, but had the personal gifts that made his devotion something other than mere obedience. He was genuinely exceptional, and the tragedy of his existence is amplified by the fact that his gifts were ultimately in service of a relationship and a system that consumed him. Fact 131. The mushroom crown headpiece and related mushroom items are among the stranger cosmetic options in Elden Ring, and their lore connects them to the frenzied flame traditions and to areas of the game associated with disease and growth. The Lake of Rot and the poisonous swamps of the game serve as visual environments for an aspect of the game's world where growth is uncontrolled and unpleasant, a counterpoint to the controlled and beautiful growth associated with the Erd Tree. Fact 132. The Frenzied Flame Seal and the incantations associated with it have item descriptions that consistently reference the idea of shared suffering and equalization as core tenets of the Frenzied Flames philosophy. The flame does not promise power exactly. It promises dissolution, the end of distinction, the elimination of the gap between the fortunate and the unfortunate by eliminating both. This makes it the most radical possible response to the inequalities produced by the Golden Order, which is one reading of why the game makes it available as a player option at all. Fact 133. The churches of Marika scattered throughout the lands between are each dedicated to a specific aspect of Marika's power or history, and visiting all of them is essentially a pilgrimage through her mythology. The Church of Eller near the game's starting point is the humblest and most basic, while the larger churches, deeper in the game's geography, represent more elaborate theological elaborations of the same core devotion. The fact that all of them are now largely empty or occupied by enemies is the environmental argument for what the shattering cost in terms of institutional continuity. Fact 134. The Sending Gate mechanic, which allows you to travel between specific locations using stone gates, is described in the game's background lore as a form of infrastructure associated with the Erd Tree's administrative network. The ability to instantaneously move between distant points is framed as a governance tool, a way of maintaining control over a large and geographically diverse territory. The fact that many of these gates still function after the shattering is evidence that physical infrastructure is more durable than the political authority that built it. Fact 135. The Perfumer enemies and the Perfumer's Grotto area suggest a craft tradition within the lands between that developed alchemical preparations capable of both healing and harming. The Perfumers are described as practitioners of a specific magical alchemical tradition, and their items include both restorative preparations and offensive compounds, suggesting a discipline that the Golden Order at some point incorporated into its broader institutional structure. Their continued operation after the shattering suggests that the craft itself is viable independent of political sponsorship. Fact 136. The Radahn Festival, that is held in Caelid as part of the game's narrative structure, and which you must trigger to face Radahn as a boss, is described as a celebration, in the sense that Radahn's corruption has made his death a mercy for him. The warriors who attend the festival are there to participate in a collective attempt to free a great warrior from an existence he would not have chosen. It is one of the more unusual framings for a boss fight in the game, where the difficulty is not framed as an obstacle, but as a measure of worthiness for performing a service. Fact 137. The Redmane Festival specifically involves Radahn's vassal Jeren, who has organized the event as an act of final devotion to his lord. Jeren's dialogue and the way the festival is described point toward a genuine affection for Radahn among those who served him, which adds another dimension to the sadness of the Caelid situation. The people who loved Radahn most are the ones who must arrange for his killing. Fact 138. The warrior Jarshard incantation, received from Alexander's remains after you defeat him in your final duel, is described as containing Alexander's power crystallized in a form you can use. This is consistent with the Jar people's philosophy, where the strength of the fallen is meant to be absorbed and carried forward. By taking this incantation, you are, in the law's terms, honoring Alexander's wish that his strength continue to be useful even after his death. Fact 139. Diolus's mask is a piece of gear associated with the Hoslo family questline that, in its item description, references the family's tradition and the personal history of the character who left it behind. Items of this kind serve as physical epitaphs for characters whose stories have concluded, letting you carry a tangible reminder of an encounter that meant something. Fact 140. The Dragon King's Cragblade weapon, associated with Dragon Lord Placidus Sax, is described as containing the compressed power of a lightning-breathing dragon who was once Elden Lord. Its properties in gameplay terms reflect this, channeling a form of draconic lightning associated specifically with Placidus Sax's tradition, rather than the more common forms of lightning magic in the game. It is one of several weapons that carry the specific flavoring of a particular character's power, rather than a generalized magical category. Fact 141. The grafted dragon fist weapon, which is literally a dragon head grafted onto a gauntlet in the style of Godric's grafting, is one of the game's more darkly humorous items. Its item description references the grafting tradition in a way that manages to be both informative and subtly appalling, noting that the dragon's breath is still intact and can be directed by the wearer. It is a weapon that carries its own lore about what kind of person would build such a thing, and what kind of person would choose to use it. Fact 142. The Godslayer Greatsword, associated with the Godskin faction, is described as a weapon used for the specific purpose of killing gods. Its moveset involves the black flame that burns divine essence, and its design, a large sword with a distinctive curve and a black flame aesthetic, is one of the more visually distinctive greatsword designs in the game. The idea of a weapon specifically engineered for god killing and then used by a specific professional class of god killers is one of the game's more elaborate institutional lore details. Fact 143. The Rancor Call and ancient Death Rancor sorceries are associated with the death magic tradition that runs through the game's underground areas and connects to Godwyn's corruption. Their item descriptions reference the anger of those who died incorrectly, whose deaths were not properly resolved, and whose remaining spirit has condensed into a form that can be wielded as a weapon. This framing gives the magic a quality of righteous grievance, the power of unfinished business. Fact 144. The Sword of Milos, which you can find as a drop from a specific enemy in the game, is named after a character who appears to be connected to the death-associated traditions and whose story is told entirely through the item description. Milos is not an NPC you meet. He is a person who existed, lost something or someone, and the grief of that loss crystallized into a weapon that the world eventually produced as loot. It is a small and poignant piece of world building in an entirely passive form. Fact 145. The Land of Shadows and the expansion to the game's world introduced in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC adds considerable depth to the game's existing lore, particularly around Miquella's character and the history of the Erdtree's founding. Without going into everything the DLC contains, it is worth noting that even the base game contains numerous hints and unresolved threads that the DLC was clearly designed to address, and that several items in the base game have descriptions that reference people and events you can only fully understand after completing the expansion. Fact 146. Miquella's needle and its function as both a key item in Millicent's questline and as the reversal for the frenzied flame ending suggests that Miquella's research into unalloyed gold was genuinely advanced. He was not simply making the material that blocks the outer gods, he was making something that could undo their influence retroactively, after contact had been made. The sophistication of this implies a level of understanding of how outer gods operate that goes far beyond what any other character in the game demonstrates. Fact 147. The Talisman of Lord is an item that simply increases rune acquisition and is given to you by finger-crone Enya early in the game. Its description notes that it is the mark of one destined to become an Elden Lord, which is a small piece of world building about the ceremonies and symbolic objects associated with the title. It suggests that becoming Elden Lord is not just a power achievement, but involves a formal acknowledgement through objects and rituals, an institutional legitimacy on top of the raw achievement of killing the demigods. Fact 148. The Saurasiel and Scarseal's talismans, which increase your stats at the cost of increasing damage taken, are described in their lore as implements of training that accept physical cost in exchange for forced development. The concept of deliberately submitting to a harsher version of existence to accelerate growth is one that resonates with several of the game's character arcs, particularly those of characters who have accepted suffering as a condition of their strength rather than fighting to eliminate it. Fact 149. The Blessed Dew Talisman, which provides slow health regeneration, is described as containing a blessing of the Erd Tree concentrated enough to sustain the wearer continuously. The idea of the Erd Tree's grace as something that can be bottled and carried resonates with the broader sacramental logic of the game's religious traditions, where divine power is mediated through objects and practices rather than experienced directly. Fact 150. The Stargazer's heirloom talisman is described as an heirloom from the Alabaster Lord enemies who appear in the game's underground regions. The Alabaster Lords are described as stone beings who fell from the stars, like the Estelle, but rather than being destructive, they have simply existed in the lands between in a kind of alien detachment. Their connection to Starfall and to an extraterrestrial origin is one of the more suggestive pieces of lore about the game's cosmology, implying that the relationship between the lands between and the stars involves regular traffic of beings and objects in both directions. Fact 151. The Nomadic Merchant questline, to the extent it exists, involves a connected network of wandering merchants who share a tragic backstory involving imprisonment and isolation. Items you can purchase from them occasionally reference this backstory, and the musical instrument that one merchant plays at the end of his location is described as the last remaining object from a tradition of performance that has otherwise been lost. He is one of several characters in the game who represents the preservation of culture across catastrophe through the simplest possible means. Fact 152. The Flask of Wondrous Physic is a mechanic that allows customization of a special one-use flask with 2 tier items that provide various effects. Each tier is described in its lore as a substance with a specific origin and property, and collectively they add up to an unusual catalogue of the game's magical materials. The crystal tier that combines with scarlet rot, for instance, is described as having formed in the soil of Caelid, the landscape itself, producing a substance shaped by the rot that pervades it. Fact 153. The Academy Glintstone Seal is described as having been issued to graduates of the Academy as proof of their formal certification. The idea of a magical institution issuing a standardized seal of completion to its practitioners is an unusual piece of institutional world building, implying a level of bureaucratic organization within the Academy that the broader setting of the lands between does not always suggest. Fact 154. The Erd Tree Great Shield is described as being imbued with the power of the Erd Tree's flame and as having been carried by the Erd Tree avatars who serve as bosses throughout the game. The Erd Tree avatars are described as the Erd Tree's own guardians, extensions of its will rather than independent warriors who chose to serve it. And their boss encounters throughout the minor Erd Trees suggest a defensive network that the Erd Tree maintains independently of any human or demigod authority. Fact 155. The jellyfish spirit ash is one of the simpler summons in the game, both in terms of gameplay and in terms of lore, but the item description of the large puppet jellyfish is worth noting. It references the jellyfish as an entity that exists near the Erd tree, feeding on the grace that suffuses its environment, which is a quiet detail about the ecology of a world where divine power is a physical substance that affects even non-intelligent creatures. Fact 156. The Flame Grant Me Strength incantation is one of several body buffing incantations in the game, but its description is notably different from the others. It references a prayer from one of the game's warrior traditions that asks not for protection or favor, but simply for more of what the practitioner already has, a request for amplification rather than transformation. It is a small detail about character and aspiration that the mechanical function does not require, but that the lore provides anyway. Fact 157. The rune of the unborn that Renala has cradled is described in more detail in certain game files and supplementary materials as a rune associated with the concept of return and renewal, the opposite of the rune of death. The pairing of Renala, the queen associated with rebirth, with this rune in her broken and cradling state, is one of the game's more poetic visual configurations. A powerful symbol of regeneration, reduced to a kind of helpless stasis by grief. Fact 158. The Round Table Knight Vike Spirit Ash, obtained after completing certain content, comes with an item description that expands on his backstory in ways that his in-game appearances do not. The description confirms that he was genuinely close to becoming Elden Lord, and makes his fall feel like a real loss rather than just a cautionary example. The game is consistent in its refusal to present failed Tarnished as simply lesser. They are people who encountered impossible circumstances and were undone by them. Fact 159. The Golden Lineage Evergale is a location that imprisons a figure associated with the Golden Order's enforcement tradition, and the Evergale mechanic in general is one of the game's more interesting institutional details. Evergaols are described as prisons that bind their occupants in a dimension outside normal time and space, accessible only to those with the specific medallion. The existence of this prison technology implies a legal and judicial tradition within the Golden Order that went beyond simply executing offenders. Some people were considered worth containing rather than simply eliminating. Fact 160. The Omen Killer boss type appears in several locations throughout the game, and is described as a class of warrior specifically employed to hunt down and kill omens, the cursed children born with beastly features. The existence of a professional class of omen hunters within the Golden Order's world is one of the more disturbing institutional details in the game, implying a systematic persecution that went beyond individual incidents of violence into organized practice. Fact 161. Hyetta's final transformation in her questline, in which she becomes a Maiden of the Three Fingers in a way that is costly and irreversible, is presented with the same visual grammar that the game uses for other transformations associated with outer gods. The body changes, the eyes change, and something that was individual and recognizable becomes a vessel for something larger and less personal. It is the same process depicted differently for different outer gods, and the game uses this visual consistency to make a subtle point about how all outer gods ultimately treat people as means rather than ends. Fact 162. The Nox people, who built the cities of Nokron and Nokstella, are described in various item texts as a civilization with genuine technological and magical sophistication who were driven underground by the Erd Tree's expansion. Their silver technology, which produced the silver tear liquid entities and the ghost flame and other distinctive magical traditions, represents an independent line of development that existed parallel to the Academy's tradition without necessarily being in dialogue with it. They are one of several buried histories in the game's world. Fact 163. Deathroot and the cat beast associated with it, the Tibia Mariner boss type, represent another piece of the game's death-associated lore. The Tibia Mariners are described as ancient soldiers who were assigned to transport the dead to their proper places within the Erd Tree's cycle, carrying bone boats filled with skeletal cargo. Their continued existence as enemies that summon skeletons against you suggests that their function has been corrupted by the same forces that corrupted death more broadly in the world. Fact 164. The craftsman's hammer and other basic crafting tools in the game are described with lore that suggests the craft traditions of the lands between were highly developed and regionally specific. Certain materials can only be found in certain areas, and the craft books that unlock specific craft recipes are described as containing regional knowledge that would have been passed down within specific communities. The fragmentation of the world after the shattering disrupted these knowledge networks, and your ability to collect craft books from across the game represents a kind of consolidation of distributed knowledge. Fact 165. The windy crystal tear and similar materials are described as byproducts of processes associated with the game's magical systems, things that form when specific types of energy interact with the physical world over long periods. The idea that the Lands Between's landscape is full of magical residue from centuries of divine activity, in the form of collectible materials with specific properties, is one of the more quietly elaborate pieces of world-building in the game. Fact 166. The Raya Lucarian sorceries that Selen teaches you are described as the classical curriculum of the Academy, the agreed-upon foundation of what a trained sorcerer knows. Their item descriptions collectively sketch out an intellectual tradition that valued rigor and categorization, developing systematic explanations for the properties of glintstone, the behavior of magical forces, and the theoretical framework underlying the visual effects. They are the academic canon of a dead institution. Fact 167. Commander O'Neill in the heart of Aeonia Swamp in Caelid is described as a military commander of the Clean Rot Knights, who remained at his post after the Scarlet Rot transformed the landscape around him. His continued presence in the center of the most heavily rot-affected area of the game, still commanding Clean Rot Knights, who are now themselves infested with rot blossoms, is one of the more visually striking examples of the game's theme of duty outlasting its context. He is doing his job in the ruins of the world his job was designed to protect. Fact 168. The Scorpion Knight enemies found in Radahn's territory are described as warriors in Radahn's army who used scorpion tail weapons in his service. Their item drops confirm their service in Radahn's military traditions, and their continued patrol of Caelid after Radahn's mental deterioration and the devastation of the landscape is another example of soldiers continuing to serve a function long after the authority that created them has ceased to be coherent. Fact 169. The Rot Knight enemies in Malenia's area are distinguishable from the Clean Rot Knights in a significant way. Clean Rot Knights coated their armor to resist the rot. Rot Knights have been consumed by it, their bodies now bearing scarlet rot blossoms in a way that suggests the protective preparations eventually failed. The transition from Clean Rot Knight to Rot Knight, implied by their appearance in the same area, is a quiet chronicle of attrition, the gradual failure of a defense maintained against impossible odds. Fact 170. The ancient dragon Lanciax's glaive incantation, in addition to being a powerful weapon spell, has item lore that references a specific event in the ancient past, involving Lanciax's use of this lightning in a battle with significance to the draconic tradition. The specificity of this reference, even without providing full context for what the battle was, gives the incantation a historical weight that makes using it feel like invoking something real rather than just accessing a spell slot. Fact 171. The Crucible Axe Armor set, associated with the Crucible Knight tradition, is described in its item texts as armor from the time before the current age that has been preserved through the knight's own care and dedication. The physical preservation of the armor over what must be an enormous span of time is attributed to the ongoing attention of people who considered their tradition worth maintaining even when the world had moved past it. The armor is old because the people who wear it chose not to let it age. Fact 172. The Scarlet Bloom flower, which appears in several areas of the game associated with the Scarlet Rot, is described as a flower that grows only in places where the rot has fully taken hold. It is listed as a crafting material and also appears as an environmental detail in the Aeonia Swamp and in Malenia's boss area, where the petals of scarlet flowers falling during her second phase are one of the game's most visually distinctive boss visual effects. What the item description quietly notes is that the flower is beautiful. The Scarlet Rot produces beauty in the things it creates, even as it destroys the things it touches. which is consistent with the game's general refusal to make its threats simply ugly. Fact 173. The ending you ultimately choose in Elden Ring is not framed by the game as a right answer. It is framed as a choice made by a specific person at a specific moment after experiencing everything the lands between has to offer, and the game trusts you to make it with full awareness of what you have seen. Every ending has a mending rune or a guiding principle behind it. Every ending represents someone's answer to the question of what a broken world needs most. The age the world enters after your final choice is not shown. You see only the moment of the change, the light on the horizon, the throne, or the absence of it, and then the screen goes dark. The Erd Tree stood for an age because people believed in it, and what replaces it will stand or fall on the same principle. Now, while we have covered all 173 facts that form the spine of this video, there is a substantial amount of lore, context, and detail that deserves a deeper treatment than a single fact entry can provide. What follows is an extended exploration of the world of Elden Ring, organized around the themes, characters, and mysteries that have generated the most genuine curiosity among players and researchers over the years. Some of this will revisit territory from the facts section and expand on it. Some of it will take you into corners of the game that even dedicated players might not have spent much time in. All of it is worth knowing if you want to understand what FromSoftware built with this game. The greater will is the most powerful and most distant of the outer gods referenced in Elden Ring's lore, and its nature is one of the most genuinely contested questions in the community. The game describes it as an entity of immense power that communicated its will to the lands between through the Elden Beast and the Two Fingers, and its general agenda appears to be the imposition of order on a world that was previously more chaotic. But the game never directly explains what the greater will wants order for, or what it gains from the Erd Tree's existence in the lands between. Several lore researchers have pointed to the possibility that the greater will is not acting out of malice, or even indifference, but out of a logic that is simply too alien to the people of the lands between to be comprehensible. It does not treat the lands between as a home or a community deserving of consideration. It treats it as a site for the implementation of a cosmological principle, the way you might treat a field as a site for agriculture, without having any particular feelings about the soil. This reading is supported by how the Two Fingers communicate. They do not explain or reason with people. They transmit. The finger readers who interpret them are not engaged in a dialogue with the greater will. They are receiving a signal and translating it, and the signal does not change based on what the people receiving it need or want to know. This is fundamentally different from how the other outer gods seem to operate. The Formless Mother, who chose Mog, engaged with him personally enough to grant him specific powers in response to his specific devotion. The god of Scarlet Rot uses Melania as a vessel, but in doing so has been in a kind of active negotiation with her body and her will for her entire life. The Frenzied Flame actively seeks out people who have been stripped of everything and offers them the comfort of dissolution. These outer gods are engaged in different and often terrible ways with the specific people they touch. The greater will communicates through intermediaries and infrastructure, governing at a remove that suggests either enormous power or profound disinterest, or both. Marika's position as the goddess of the Erd Tree is therefore something more complicated than a position of honor. She was the greater will's chosen vessel, its representative in the lands between, and the whole structure of her civilization, the Erd Tree, the Golden Order, the system of grace and death and rebirth, was built to maintain that relationship. The fact that she eventually shattered the Elden Ring suggests that at some point she stopped being willing to maintain it, which in turn implies that there was a time when she was willing, and that whatever changed her mind must have been significant. The death of Godwyn is the most commonly cited catalyst, but the lore suggests a longer process of disillusionment. The Golden Order's treatment of the omens alone, and Marika's apparent awareness that her own children were among those the system persecuted, points toward a decades-long accumulation of evidence that the system she maintained was cruel in ways she had not anticipated or had chosen not to see. There is something almost bureaucratic about the tragedy of Marika. She built a system. The system developed its own logic, and that logic began producing outcomes she did not endorse and could not easily stop because stopping them would require dismantling the foundations of her own power. The Erd Tree's rule against omens was not her personal decree in the way that some of her later choices were. It was the crystallization of cultural attitudes within the civilization that formed around the Erd Tree's power, the kind of institutional cruelty that develops gradually and becomes self-sustaining. By the time her children Morgott and Moog were being shoved into sewers for being born with horns, the practice was old enough that challenging it would have been treated as an attack on the Golden Order itself. The god who was supposed to be above all of this was herself caught inside it. Radagon's role in all of this is worth spending time on because his existence as a separate persona within Marika complicates the picture considerably. If Radagon and Marika are the same person, then Marika's love for the Golden Order and Marika's eventual rebellion against it were happening simultaneously in the same body for much of the game's backstory. The item description that notes Radagon's attempt to repair the Elden Ring, which he was reportedly trying to do when Marika was shattering it, is the most direct expression of this internal war. He is working with both hands to destroy and repair the same thing at the same time. The statue of Radagon and Marika merged together that you find in the Erd Tree's interior is the most literal visual representation of this. But the implications of it resonate throughout everything both of them did during their lives. One reading that several law scholars have found compelling is that Radagon was not simply a persona Marika created for political convenience, but a genuine expression of a different aspect of her personality, one that became so developed and so distinct that it had its own goals, relationships, and beliefs. Renala's grief over losing Radagon becomes more complicated when you consider that the person she loved may have been genuinely real in a meaningful sense, not a deception but a facet of a larger consciousness that chose her and then was redirected by forces larger than either of them. Radagon's children, with Renala, Rykard, Radahn, and Ranni, are therefore Marika's children in some sense, which means that when the Shattering scattered all the demigods into conflict with each other, it was in some ways a family war between different aspects of the same divine consciousness, expressing themselves through different vessels. The Empyrean system deserves more attention than it usually gets in introductory lore discussions. Empyreans are described as beings with the potential to become gods in the way that Marika became a god, to serve as a vessel for an outer god's power and reshape the world according to that power's logic. The game identifies several Empyreans: Marika herself, obviously, Ranni, Miquella, and Malenia. Each of them was a candidate for a kind of divine succession, and each of them responded to that candidacy differently. Ranni rejected it and fled. Miquella attempted to create an alternative to it. Malenia was consumed by the outer god's power without the process ever being formalized. And the framework that existed to manage these candidacies, the two fingers assigning shadows to each Empyrean as a guardian and guide, was itself a mechanism of control designed to funnel their potential into the greater will's preferred channel. The shadows assigned to each Empyrean are worth examining. Ranni's shadow was Blade, a half-wolf created for the purpose. Marika's shadow was Malekith, the black blade beast. The shadows are described as beings wholly devoted to their Empyrean service, but also, in a more troubling reading, as mechanisms for keeping the Empyreans on the greater will's preferred path. Blade's eventual madness, which happens when Ranni definitively removes herself from the greater will's influence, supports this reading. He was not simply her loyal servant, he was the mechanism by which the two fingers maintained their connection to her. And when that connection was severed, the mechanism broke. The Knight of Black Knives, returning to it with this context in mind, starts to look less like an isolated act of rebellion and more like the climax of a long strategic campaign. Ranni needed to kill her soul while her body survived, the inverse of what was done to Godwyn. She needed to accomplish this using a piece of the Rune of Death, which was stored inside the Elden Ring and accessible only through an act of unprecedented theft. The Black Knife Assassins were Numen women, the same ethnic group as Marika herself, which suggests they had access to knowledge and perhaps to places that ordinary assassins would not. The coordination required to kill multiple demigods simultaneously, to steal from the Elden Ring, to create the specific blades needed, and to ensure that Ranni's death went the way she needed it to go. All of this implies years of planning and a network of conspirators whose full extent the game never reveals. We see the results. The process remains largely in shadow. One of the most suggestive, unresolved questions in the lore is who helped Rani beyond the Numen assassins. The scale of the operation seems too large for the people we can identify as participants. Some lore researchers have pointed toward Fear as a possible participant given her connection to death-associated traditions and her own agenda around the Rune of Death. Others have pointed toward the possibility that Godwyn himself was an unwilling co-conspirator, his death being used, without his knowledge or consent, as the specific necessary act that would give Rani cover for her own simultaneous self-killing. The game supports neither of these readings conclusively, but it does not rule them out either, which is the state in which most of the most interesting Elden Ring lore resides. The Liurnia of the Lakes region, which is where much of the game's middle section takes place, and which contains the Academy of Raya Lucaria as its centerpiece, is one of the more historically layered areas in the game. The lakes themselves are described as having formed as a result of the Raya Lucaria Academy's magical activities over centuries. The sorcery practiced within its walls having altered the geography of the surrounding land over time. The Carian Manor in the far north of the region sits on territory that predates the Academy, and the tension between the old Carian tradition and the newer institutional structure of the Academy is reflected in how those two spaces relate to each other architecturally and environmentally. The manor is isolated and dignified. The Academy is large and institutional. Both were eventually absorbed into the Golden Order's broader structure through Radagon's political marriage, but they never quite became the same kind of place. The village of Albinorix in Liurnia is one of the game's quieter tragedies because of how ordinary it is in the context of the game's larger horrors. These are artificial people who built a community, who had a culture and mutual support structures, and presumably some form of daily life, and by the time you arrive, most of them are dead or dying, victims of a pogrom that is treated in the surrounding world as unremarkable. The guards who participated in the attack on the village are soldiers following the logic of the Golden Order's broader attitude toward beings that don't fully fit its definitions of legitimate humanity. The Albinorix were not killed because of something they did, but because of what they were, and the game does not editorialize about this. It simply shows you the ruins and the survivors, and lets you understand what happened. The Weeping Peninsula, which is the southern region of the starting area and one of the earliest places many players explore, contains a disproportionate amount of interesting minor lore. The Church of Pilgrimage at the peninsula's southern tip was clearly once an active site of religious practice, and the items you find there suggest a tradition of pilgrimage that once drew devotees from across the lands between. The Tombswood ruins in the area are described as the remnants of a community that maintained the catacombs network in the region, and the heroes' graves scattered throughout the peninsula suggest that this was considered significant territory even before the current age. The Erd tree that grows in the center of the region, smaller than the main tree but still enormous, gives the peninsula a quality of being a satellite of the main Erd tree's power rather than an independent location. Castle Morn, at the southern tip of the Weeping Peninsula, has a backstory that the game delivers through item descriptions and environmental detail rather than through cutscenes or extended NPC dialogue. The Misbegotten, who are the winged cat humanoid enemies you fight throughout the castle, are described as a servile race kept in bondage by the castle's human inhabitants. At some point before you arrive, they rose up against their masters in a rebellion that left both the Misbegotten and the castle's human population largely destroyed. The one human survivor you find, a woman named Irina who sends you to find her father inside the castle, is a figure trying to maintain human connection in a place where that connection has been shattered by violence that the game implicitly attributes to the conditions of servitude rather than to any inherent violence in the Misbegotten themselves. Irina's father Edgar is a knight who refused to abandon his post even as the castle fell around him. His devotion to his duty, which prevents him from going to his daughter when she needs him, and the consequences of that devotion for both of them, form one of the game's smaller but more genuinely affecting tragic arcs. Edgar is not a villain. He is a man whose sense of duty has outgrown its proper scale, and the cost of that excess falls on someone who did nothing to deserve it. The leonine Misbegotten boss at the end of Castle Morn is described in its item lore as the leader of the Misbegotten rebellion, a figure around whom the others organized their uprising. The weapon you receive from defeating it, the grafted blade greatsword mentioned earlier in this video, is the trophy of that rebellion's leader, which makes your taking it from the boss an act whose ethical implications the game does not comment on. You are taking something from the leader of an uprising against bondage. Whether that is heroic or complicated is left to you. The Stormhill region, which is the elevated area leading up to Stormvale Castle from the starting field, contains several items and details that flesh out the history of the Stormhawk Knights, the eagle-associated warrior tradition that was based at the castle before Godric's takeover. The Stormhawk Dew and Stormhawk Feather items reference a tradition of incorporating stormbirds into military ceremonies and equipment, and the Stormhawk, a spirit you can summon based on this tradition, is described as having been the companion of a knight who served the castle before Godric's usurpation. The presence of these items alongside the Stormhawk set armor suggests a coherent warrior culture that Godric replaced rather than built upon, which gives his occupation of the castle a quality of cultural erasure on top of the political displacement. Nefeli's introduction in the castle, where you find her fighting Godric's soldiers to avenge the people Godric has used for his grafting, establishes her as someone who has a moral dimension to her fighting that many of the game's combat encounters do not. She is not there for personal advancement or in pursuit of the Elden Ring. She is there because something was done to people who did not deserve it, and she found that unacceptable. This characterization makes her one of the more straightforwardly good-hearted characters in the game's cast, which in turn makes her vulnerability to Seleuvis's poison plot more disturbing when you discover it. The history of the Tarnished as a collective, rather than as individual characters, is one of the more interesting background elements in the game. They were Godfrey's people, warriors who fought alongside the first Elden Lord in the Wars of Conquest that unified the lands between under the Erdtree's authority. When Godfrey was exiled, they went with him into the lands beyond, and they have apparently been wandering there for an enormous span of time, long enough that the culture that produced them has been replaced by entirely different civilizations in the lands between. When they are called back by grace, they come from a world that has moved on, bringing skills and attitudes shaped by a different set of conditions. The Tarnished's condition of being outside the Erdtree's grace during their exile has made them resilient in ways that the inhabitants of the lands between are not. The people who live under the Erdtree's light are dependent on it in ways they may not fully understand, their health and continuation tied to a system they take for granted. The Tarnished have survived without that system for a long time, which is why they can die repeatedly and return in a way that ordinary inhabitants of the lands between cannot. They have developed an independence from divine infrastructure that is both the source of their strength and the reason they were the chosen instruments for the task of remaking the Elden Ring. The question of who specifically summoned the Tarnished back is one that the game leaves interestingly ambiguous. The Two Fingers claim responsibility, framing the summons as the greater will calling its chosen warriors back to restore the Elden Ring. But the timing of the summons, coming as it does after the shattering and during a period when the Greater Will's preferred candidate Marika is imprisoned in the Erdtree and the system is in chaos, suggests that the summons might not have been the Greater Will's clean plan, but rather a desperate measure taken by its intermediaries, in the absence of better options. The Two Fingers describe themselves as serving the Greater Will, but the Greater Will itself does not speak in the game. Everything we know about its intentions is mediated. Alternatively, and this is a reading that several lore researchers have found compelling, the summons that calls the Tarnished back might not originate with the Two Fingers at all, or not only with them. Melina's presence as a guide for the specific Tarnished you play as suggests someone is directing specific attention toward your character, beyond the general broadcast that drew other Tarnished back. The guidance of grace that appears as golden wisps leading you through the world is presented as the Erdtree's direction. But the Erdtree has been compromised since the shattering. The precise nature of the guidance you follow throughout the game is one of its most persistent mysteries. The Erdtree itself, returning to it as a physical presence in the world, is worth thinking about at length because the game gives you so many different ways to see it. From the starting field of Limgrave, it is a distant golden glow on the horizon, beautiful and unreachable. As you approach Leyndell, it becomes enormous, its scale impossible to fully comprehend, its light casting the entire region in a perpetual golden afternoon. Inside the Erdtree, after you burn it, you find not the sacred interior of a divine dwelling, but the Elden Throne and the physical evidence of centuries of divine administration, and beyond that the realm where the Elden Beast waits. The tree is simultaneously a symbol, an institution, an organism, and a prison, containing within it the divine machinery of the greater will's governance and the imprisoned body of the god who ran it. Looking at it from the outside, you would not know any of this. It is simply the golden tree on the horizon, and it has been there for as long as anyone alive can remember. The Lanedale capital is one of the game's most architecturally impressive areas, and the history it contains, in its environmental details, rewards careful exploration. The city was clearly designed as a monument to a specific idea of civilization: gold and stone, and order arranged to communicate permanence and legitimacy. The Great Gates and the road leading up to them suggest a city that received pilgrims and delegations from across the lands between at the height of its power. The godskin noble that appears near the inner walls is an intrusion from a tradition that should not exist in the capital, a signal that the city's protective systems have failed in ways they have not in more peripheral locations. The Round Table holds position outside normal geography means that it exists in a kind of timeless bubble, untouched by the decay that has affected the rest of the world. This gives it a quality of being simultaneously a refuge and a reminder of what the world was before the shattering, a preserved moment from an era that no longer exists in the main world. The characters who gather there are people who are still trying to engage with the project of the Elden Ring quest, even as everything around them has fallen apart, which is either admirable or delusional depending on your reading of their chances. Dialos's arc at the Round Table Hold is worth tracing in full because it is one of the quieter character studies the game offers. He begins as a nobleman with a specific quest, looking for his missing servant Lanya. He is confident and somewhat imperious in his early dialogue, projecting the manner of a person who is used to having resources and social standing. As his questline progresses, and the news about Lanya becomes clear, his confidence begins to erode, and by the end of his story he is sitting quietly in a place associated with loss, having recognized that he failed in every way that mattered to him. The game does not moralize about his failure. It simply shows you where he ends up. Rogier's questline, which involves the sorcerer you meet in Stormvale Castle, who subsequently appears at the Round Table Hold, is one of the game's more compact lore deliveries. Over the course of several conversations and item exchanges, he leads you toward the information about the Black Knife Catacombs and the connection between the Knight of Black Knives and Prince of Death below Lanedale. His own condition, a mysterious illness that progressively worsens as his questline develops, is connected in a way the game leaves ambiguous to his contact with the death energy associated with the Prince of Death's area. By the time his questline concludes, he is gone, leaving behind only his spell and a letter to Ranni that reveals the depth of the affection he had developed for her through their apparently one-sided interactions. He is a figure who died reaching towards something he could not touch, which is a recurring motif in the game's NPC roster. The Iron Fist Alexander appears at a moment that will stick with any player who encountered it unexpectedly, which is stuck in a pit in Limgrave, calling for help in a voice that is simultaneously dignified and completely helpless. The contrast between his enormous physical presence and his inability to escape a hole in the ground is funny, but the game plays it without contempt. He is not embarrassed. He explains his situation, asks for your help, and when you provide it, he is simply grateful and immediately begins moving toward his next goal. His resilience is not performed, it is just how he is, and that consistency of character across the entire arc of his questline is what makes his final encounter as moving as it is. The Jarberg area, which is a small settlement of living jars in the Liurnia region, and the location of Jar Ben, the tiny jar child who is Alexander's relative, is one of the game's most unexpectedly charming locations. Jar Ben's dialogue covers everything from his admiration for Alexander to his own ambitions for adventure, and his present limitations as someone too small and inexperienced to pursue them. The settlement itself is peaceful and clearly self-sustaining, which makes it unusual in a game world where most communities have been destroyed or are in the process of being destroyed. The Jars apparently have enough independence and community structure to maintain a functioning village even in the middle of a catastrophic political collapse. The Hermit Village on Mount Gelmir, above the Volcano Manor, and accessible through the cliff paths of the mountain, is described as a community of sorcerers who chose to remove themselves entirely from the Academy's institutional structure. Their item drops and environmental details suggest practitioners of an older or more heterodox sorceress tradition, working independently and in relative peace until the volcanic and military activity of the surrounding region made their isolation increasingly difficult to maintain. The giant crab boss that is found near their village is not connected to their lore in any particular way, being simply a massive creature of the kind that appears in hazardous areas throughout the game. But its presence in proximity to the village reinforces the sense of a community that maintained itself on the margins of safer territory. The shaded castle in the Altus Plateau region is a location with specific lore connections to the perfumer tradition and to the broader question of how the Golden Order managed disease and contamination. The castle is saturated with scarlet rot, and the clean rot adjacent enemy types within it suggest that it may have been a quarantine facility at some point, a place where infected individuals or materials were contained by an institutional response to the rot's spread. By the time you visit it, the quarantine has obviously failed, but the architecture and the enemy types point toward an earlier period of organized response. The presence of Elemer of the Briar as a boss in the shaded castle adds another layer of interest. He is described in his item lore as a knight who was imprisoned within the castle, for reasons the game does not fully specify, and who eventually freed himself and claimed the castle as his own territory. His bell-bearing sword, which he is found carrying when you first see him, and which follows him autonomously in combat, is described as having been in his family for generations, a piece of personal history that survived his imprisonment. The combination of the quiet dignity of his family heirloom with the circumstances of his imprisonment and liberation creates a character portrait entirely from environmental and item details, with no direct dialogue. The Writhe-Blood ruins in the Altus Plateau region are described as a site of the Volcano Manor's activities, and the invasion that occurs there is one of the game's more contextually rich interruptions. Anastasia, the Tarnished Eater, appears here as an invader, a figure whose item lore describes a person who has taken to eating the flesh of other Tarnished in an attempt to accumulate their power and runes. She is not connected to the Dun Eater's tradition, but arrives at similar practices through different logic. A Tarnished who found the desperation of the competitive quest for the Elden Ring leading her toward increasingly extreme measures. She appears as an invader multiple times across the game, and each appearance adds a small piece to the picture of her ongoing deterioration. The golem enemies that guard various important locations throughout the lands between are described as constructs created by the Academy using a combination of sorceress knowledge and materials that the game implies were partially derived from the Academy's celestial research. Their eyes, which are glintstone formations, suggest that the golems were animated using the same star matter that powers Academy sorcery in general, which gives them a connection to the lunar tradition, even in their role as simple guards. The largest golems, which appear near the Academy's outer gates and at other significant locations, are described as particularly ancient, potentially dating to the period before Renala lost control of the institution. The Academy Crystal Cave boss in the crystal tunnels beneath Raya Lucaria is one of the game's optional areas, with particularly interesting enemy types. The Crystallians who appear throughout these areas are described as beings who have crystallized, their bodies gradually replaced by the mineral material of glintstone as a result of prolonged exposure to its energy. This transformation is presented as something that happened over time rather than all at once, a slow accumulation of crystal in the body that eventually leaves nothing recognizably organic. Whether this process was chosen, accidental, or some combination of the two is left open, but the Crystallians' continued existence as functional fighters suggests that whatever they became, they maintained enough of their original purpose to keep operating. The deep lore of the Erd Tree's biological processes is one of the more unsettling aspects of the game's setting, when you assemble it from various item descriptions. The Erd Tree absorbs the dead who are in its grace, pulling them back into the tree's root network, and eventually recycling their energy into new life granted through grace. This is described as a natural and blessed process by the Golden Order, but what it means functionally is that the Erd Tree consumes the dead, and the people who die under its influence do not truly rest, but are processed and returned. The implication that Godwyn's corrupted body, embedded in the root network beneath the capital, has been contaminating this process for a significant period of time adds a layer of horror to the Erd tree's otherwise beautiful function. Everything the tree has been absorbing for however long, since the Night of Black Knives, has been passing through a filter that is rotting. The specific mechanics of the Erd tree's relationship with omens becomes more interesting when you consider this. Omens are described as beings in whom the crucible's energy is too strong, their bodies expressing older forms of life too powerfully for the Erd tree system to accommodate them cleanly. They are not simply persecuted because they are ugly or frightening. They are persecuted because they represent a fundamental incompatibility with the Erd tree's metabolic logic. Beings who cannot be properly absorbed and recycled by a system that was designed for a different kind of life. The Golden Order's treatment of omens as abominations is cruel, but it has a kind of institutional rationality beneath it that makes it worse, not better, than simple prejudice. Morgott's extended rule of Leyndell from the shadows, which the game implies lasted throughout the period of the Shattering and the subsequent chaos, is a remarkable thing to think about. Here is a being who was sealed in the sewers of the capital as a child, kept out of sight because his existence was an embarrassment to the system his mother built. And he grew up to protect that system with a devotion that his body would never have been permitted to demonstrate publicly. He ruled as a shadow, disguising himself as Margit to engage with Tarnished directly, using every power he had to defend an order that would have killed him if it had known he was doing it. His dialogue in the boss fight, where he calls the Tarnished fools and describes his labor in the most exhausted terms imaginable, is the speech of someone who has been carrying a weight for too long and is finally being allowed to put it down. The relationship between Morgott and Mohg is one the game does not develop at length, but the details it does provide suggest two brothers who grew up in the same circumstances and arrived at entirely different responses. Morgott devoted himself to the system that had rejected him. Mohg found a different patron entirely, an outer god who offered him the recognition and power the Golden Order never would. One brother internalized the rejection and worked to prove himself worthy of a world that would never accept him. The other rejected the world that rejected him and found somewhere else to belong. Neither of them had a good outcome. Neither of them had a good start. The Cathedral of Manus Celis, which appears in Ranni's questline as the location where you place the Dark Moon Ring to complete her story, is described as an ancient place of worship associated with the moon. The split in the earth that leads to the underground space where the ritual takes place gives the area a geological weight, a sense of something very old being accessed through a crack in the world's surface. The moon that you can see through the opening above is full, which connects to Renala's tradition and to the lunar magic that runs through the Carian line. The game makes no explicit comment on the connection between the moon worshipped in that cathedral and the moon that will guide Ranni's new age, but the visual resonance is clearly intentional. The Ashen Capital, which is what Leyndell becomes after you burn the Erd tree, is one of the game's more quietly devastating environmental transformations. You have been through the capital before, seen its gold, and its soldiers, and its enormous tree, and the ash-covered version of it that you traverse in the game's final section is the same geography with all the life taken out of it. The soldiers are still there, now ash-covered, still fighting. The architecture is still there, now partially collapsed. The streets you remember are still legible beneath the ash. The city is the same and entirely different, and the specific experience of navigating a place you already know in its ruined form is one of the game's most effective uses of its open-world structure. The Great Sword of Radahn, which you can craft from his remembrance, is one of the weapons that most directly connects an item to a character's physical reality. Radahn is described as enormous, and his swords, which he carries one in each hand in his boss fight, are proportionately enormous. The lore notes that he trained himself to use them despite their impractical size, because impracticality was not a consideration he weighted heavily when choosing what to master. The swords represent a commitment to a specific idea of what his fighting should look like, regardless of whether that idea was strategically optimal. It is a small window into a personality that elsewhere presents as primarily defined by tragedy. The concept of destined death, which is the power removed from the Elden Ring and sealed into Malekith, deserves an extended discussion because it is central to understanding what is actually wrong with the world of Elden Ring at the time the game takes place. Under the current system, death in the lands between is not permanent for those within the Erd Tree's grace. They die and are recycled back into the cycle, returned in some form rather than truly ending. The Erd Tree system was described by its proponents as a blessing, the elimination of the finality of death as a gift from the divine. But the lore consistently suggests that the absence of true death creates problems that accumulate over time. The undead soldiers still fighting old battles, the demigods whose corruption has been allowed to metastasize because they cannot simply die, the accumulation of unresolved energies and incomplete endings that fills the lands between. Death, the game suggests through Fia's questline and through the Age of Duskborn ending, is not an enemy, it is a completion mechanism, and a world without it fills up with everything that should have ended but did not. The philosophical question this raises is one the game does not answer but presents clearly. Is a world with death better than a world without it, even if the world without death is also a world without true loss? The Golden Order's answer was no. Fia's answer, delivered through which ending they choose, is the only answer the game is actually interested in receiving. The Talisman of the Dusk and similar items with lore connecting them to the twilight period between the Erd Tree's dominance and whatever comes next are scattered throughout the game as artifacts of an anticipation that was never resolved. Items that reference the coming change, the expectation of a new age, appear in contexts suggesting that the world itself had been building toward a transition for a long time before the shattering made it catastrophic. The shattering was not the beginning of the world's problems. It was the moment when problems that had been contained by the system's stability were suddenly released all at once. The Firemonk faction in the mountaintops of the Giants and the flame of the Fell God they maintain is a tradition that the game presents as persisting from an era when fire worship was more openly practiced. The connection between the Fire Monks and the Fire Giants is not made entirely explicit, but the proximity of their continued practice to the region associated with the Giants suggests a tradition that developed in relationship with them and continued after the Giants' destruction. The frenzied flame seal items associated with their practice connect them tangentially to the broader fire traditions in the game, creating a network of fire-associated religions and practices that the Golden Order spent considerable effort suppressing without fully eliminating any of them. The merchant Kale in the Church of LA, near the game's starting point, is the first merchant most players encounter, and his dialogue establishes several things about the current state of the world in a few lines. He references the roads being dangerous, and trade having dried up, and his willingness to trade with a tarnished suggests that conventional social hierarchies have broken down enough that a merchant who might once have refused to deal with a tarnished outsider now has no such luxury. His camp in an abandoned church suggests either that he is not very devout or that the churches have all been abandoned long enough that camping in one carries no particular social stigma. He is a small and useful piece of world building, a man trying to maintain a profession in conditions that were not designed for it. The story of the Erd Tree burial watchdogs in the context of the game's larger death management systems is worth spending a moment on. They were created to guard the bodies of the dead in the catacombs, the period before the Erd Tree's roots could absorb them into the cycle of grace. This implies that the absorption process was not instantaneous, that bodies spent a waiting period in the catacombs before the Erd Tree processed them, and that during this period they were considered to need protection. From what? The game's catacombs are full of spirits that have not been properly absorbed, wandering undead creatures, and the various beings associated with the Deathroot corruption. It is possible that even before the Night of Black Knives and the spread of corrupted death, the Erd Tree's absorption process had vulnerabilities that the catacomb system was designed to manage. The ulcerated tree spirits, mentioned earlier in the facts section, appear in locations that all share a connection to the Erd Tree's root network. They appear in the fringes of the Stormvale area, in the Altus Plateau, in a late-game area near the capital's roots. Each appearance marks a location where the Erd Tree's roots run close to the surface and where the corruption spreading from Godwyn's body has been most active. Tracing their locations on the map gives you a rough picture of how the corruption has spread through the root network, which is one of the game's more oblique ways of telling an environmental story. The Black Knife Catacombs, which you can find in Liurnia with Rogier's guidance, contain one of the game's most significant pieces of environmental lore in the form of the mural that depicts the Knight of Black Knives. The mural shows the event in a highly stylized form, and interpreting it correctly requires some knowledge of the individuals involved. But the key detail that lore researchers are focused on is the figure who is shown separate from the assassins, the one who seems to be directing rather than participating. The game does not label this figure, and multiple interpretations exist, but the most commonly cited reading identifies it as Rani, which would confirm her role as the orchestrator of the Knight of Black Knives in a visual format rather than just through item descriptions and dialogue. The ghost flame associated with the death magic tradition is described as a form of fire that burns the spirit rather than the body, igniting the animating energy of a being rather than its physical matter. This connects it to the concept of true death as opposed to bodily death, the elimination of a being's spirit self rather than just its physical existence. The ghost flame dragon that you can encounter is one of the oldest entities in the game, a creature whose form is described as having been shaped by proximity to death energy over an enormous span of time, its fire having transformed into something more fundamentally destructive than ordinary draconic flame. The relationship between the fell god, associated with fire, and the frenzied flame, which is associated with a different form of fire, is one of the lore threads that the game leaves most deliberately ambiguous. They are clearly distinct entities with distinct cosmological positions. The fell god's fire is associated with a specific religious tradition and a specific people, the Giants, and it is described as destructive, but not necessarily chaotic. The frenzied flame is associated with the dissolution of all distinctions, a fundamentally different goal. But both are described as fires that the Golden Order feared and suppressed, and both manifest as flames that burn in ways ordinary fire does not. Whether there is a deeper connection between them, whether they are aspects of the same outer god, or simply related fire traditions that emerged in different contexts, is not resolved by the game. The concept of outer gods as a category is itself worth examining carefully. The game presents the greater will, the formless mother, the outer god of rot, the frenzied flame's source, and the fell god as the primary outer gods with influence in the lands between. But several of the game's item descriptions reference other forces and entities that are harder to categorize. The moon is described in Carian magic as something that has power and perhaps consciousness, and the specific quality of Rani's dark moon is described as distinct from the ordinary moon in ways that suggest it has its own cosmological significance. Whether the moon represents an outer god, a more bounded magical phenomenon, or something else entirely, is another of the game's deliberately unresolved questions. The Nox civilization's astronomical religion, which worshipped the stars and the moon in ways the Erdtree could not accommodate, is one of the most interesting parallel traditions in the game because it developed underground. The idea of a culture whose religious practice involves looking up at stars that they cannot see from where they live, maintaining astronomical traditions through generations of subterranean existence, is both beautiful and strange. The artificial star ceiling of Nokron, with its glowing points of light embedded in the cave ceiling, is the most literal expression of this. A civilization that recreated the sky it had been denied as a central element of its sacred space. The connection between Nokron and the Silver Tears is one of the more technically unusual pieces of lore in the game. Silver Tears are described as a liquid that takes the form of whatever it encounters, and they were apparently created by the Nox civilization in an attempt to fashion a vessel that could house a divine presence. The fact that they copy you when you encounter them in Nokron, and that the Mimic Tier boss is their most developed form, suggests that the Nox technology for creating these mimetic entities was sophisticated enough to capture and replicate organic complexity. The question of what happened to these Silver Tears between the submersion of Nokron and the present day, whether they persisted in their created form or degenerated, is suggested by the state you find them in, but not fully answered. Dragon Lord Pasadusak's connection to the pre-Erdtree age is one of the most emotionally resonant pieces of lore in the game for many players, because it presents a figure whose entire existence is defined by waiting for something that will never come. He was Elden Lord in the age before Marika, serving a god whose name has been erased from history. When that god abandoned or was destroyed or departed in some way the game does not specify, Placidus Sax did not move on. He did not find a new purpose or a new patron. He remained in the crumbling Farum Azula, in a space outside normal time where the weather and the architecture, and presumably Placidus Sax himself, are caught in a moment of becoming that cannot complete itself because the thing it was becoming toward is gone. You are the intrusion into this suspended grief when you fight him. The battle is beautiful and strange, and his death animation, with the golden light leaving his form, has a quality of release that the fight itself earns. The recurring motif of beings who outlast the purpose for which they were created is one of the game's central themes, running from the small scale of individual NPCs, like Knights Cavalry, to the cosmic scale of Placidus Sax. The world of Elden Ring is full of things that kept going after the context that gave them meaning was removed, and the player moves through this world as one more such thing, a tarnished whose original purpose, fighting alongside Godfrey, is centuries in the past, now acting on the instructions of a new purpose that may or may not be what it claims to be. The mountaintops of the giants and their relationship to the broader geography of the lands between is worth examining. They are described as the highest point in the known world, and the journey up to them involves passing through the Grand Lift of Rold, which is itself described as an ancient infrastructure built to facilitate the specific ritual of reaching the Fire of Ruin atop the mountains. The lift was built with the expectation that someone would eventually need to use it for this purpose, which implies that the preservation of the Fire of Ruin and the possibility of burning the Erd Tree was anticipated, not by the Golden Order necessarily, but by someone who built the infrastructure to make it possible. This is another of the game's suggestions that the current crisis was not entirely unforeseeable. The Forge of the Giants itself, where you must choose to burn the Erd Tree using either the Frenzied Flame's power if you have received it, or Melina's sacrifice if you have not, is a space of enormous weight. The choice the game presents there, between accepting Melina's self-immolation and using your own body as the source of the destructive flame, is one of the most genuinely difficult moral choices the game offers, because neither option is good. You either watch someone die for you, or you become something you may not want to be. The game does not let you reason your way to a comfortable answer. It simply presents the moment and waits. Melina's sacrifice, if you allow it, is described in her dialogue as something she has been moving towards since the beginning, a purpose she understood even if she did not always name it. Her acceptance of it is not resigned but clear-eyed, and her last words to you before the burning carry a quality of genuine affection for the person you've been through the game's entire journey. This is effective precisely because the game has been so restrained in developing her as a character throughout, offering small moments of personality and care without ever making her arc feel artificially emotional. When the emotional weight arrives, it has been accumulated across dozens of hours rather than manufactured in a cutscene. The ability to visit the Church of Vows and use Celestial Dew to receive absolution for sins that have turned NPCs hostile towards you is one of the game's more thoughtful mechanical choices. The absolution is handled through a ritual with Miriel that the game presents as genuine rather than transactional. And the fact that it works for both ordinary social transgressions and larger narrative sins suggests a world in which the possibility of repair is taken seriously even in the context of a civilization that has broken down. Miriel himself, the giant turtle who has presumably been performing this service since before many of the game's other characters were born, is one of the game's most consistent arguments for the value of patient, non-judgmental presence. The Round Table holds function as a neutral ground for all tarnished is made explicit through how it handles player interactions. Multiple hostile NPC storylines pause when those NPCs are encountered in the Round Table, because it is described as a place where the rules of the outside world do not apply in the same way. This is a mechanical convention, but it has a lore explanation that the game deploys seriously, the idea of a space outside normal geography being also outside normal social structures. The Hold is a place of uneasy truce by design. The multiplayer systems of Elden Ring, the cooperative summons and invasions, and the various multiplayer covenants implied by the game's mechanics are all described in lore terms that give them a kind of in-universe significance. Cooperative play is framed as summoning the echoes of other tarnished who have walked similar paths. Invasions are described as the breaking of the laws of the lands between by those who would prey on others.